Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today we're talking about that time when the world's two newest superpowers found a country they might both forgotten about and decided the best way to handle it was with a Sharpie and a complete lack of foresight. That's right, we're diving into the Korean situation, a geopolitical mess so profoundly dumb it makes most family arguments look like Nobel Peace Prize negotiations. Think of it as the world's worst group project where the two team leaders hate each other. The quietest member of the group is suddenly told they're now two separate people, and the final presentation ends in a 3-year-long fistfight. Now, I know what you are thinking. You cannot possibly simplify decades of complex international relations and a brutal war into a series of sarcastic remarks. And to that I say, watch me. Before the inevitable betrayal starts, if you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. Our story begins in August 1945, the chaotic, confetti-filled, and slightly radioactive end of World War II. The Empire of Japan, after a truly horrifying run, had finally been knocked out of the ring. 2 atomic haymakers had landed, and Emperor Hirohito got on the radio to tell his people that the whole unconditional surrender thing was, in fact, happening. The world erupts in celebration. Times Square is a sea of kissing strangers. London is having a much-needed pint. And Moscow is, well, Moscow is probably just relieved the endless tide of bodies has stopped. Victory. Good guys win, bad guys lose, roll credits, except not quite. See, when a massive empire collapses, it doesn't just neatly vanish, it leaves behind a whole lot of stuff. It's like the world's biggest, most evil landlord being evicted and leaving behind a bunch of confused, traumatized tenants in apartments they don't technically own anymore. And one of the biggest, most strategically important, and longest suffering of these properties was the Korean Peninsula. For 35 long, brutal years, Korea had been a colony of Japan. And when I say colony, I don't mean the quaint British let's build a railroad and force everyone to drink tea version. I mean that we're going to systematically erase your culture, steal your resources, force you to change your names and conscript you into our forever wars version. It was, to put it mildly, not a good time. The Korean people had fought, resisted, and dreamed of independence for decades, and now suddenly, miraculously, it was here. The Japanese were gone. Freedom. But what is freedom when your oppressor is vanquished overnight by 2 foreign superpowers you've barely even met? It's chaos. It's a beautiful, hopeful, disorganized mess. Across the peninsula, Koreans began forming their own local governing bodies, the so-called People's Committees, in an attempt to build a nation from the ground up. They were ready. They had plans. They had a future in mind. Unfortunately for them, their future was about to be decided by 2 guys who couldn't agree on what to have for lunch, let alone how to build a country. Enter our main characters for this act, the United States and the Soviet Union. Throughout the war, they'd been the world's most dysfunctional power couple, united only by their mutual hatred of a certain German gentleman with a questionable mustache. Now that he was gone, they were starting to give each other the side-eye at the global dinner table. America, high on its own supply of victory and atomic bravado, saw itself as the world's new benevolent leader, ready to spread democracy and capitalism whether you asked for it or not. The Soviet Union, having clawed its way back from the brink of annihilation and chewed up half of Europe in the process, saw a golden opportunity to create a buffer zone of friendly, like-minded communist states. And there, sitting right between their spheres of influence, was Korea. A strategically juicy peninsula bordering Soviet Russia, a stone's throw from newly communist curious China, and right across the sea from a now pacifist American-occupied Japan. It was the geopolitical equivalent of the last slice of pizza at a party. Both of them wanted it. Neither of them wanted the other to have it. The Soviet Red Army, having been fighting the Japanese in Manchuria, was already on the scene. Their tanks rolled into the northern part of Korea basically moments after Japan threw in the towel. America, meanwhile, was still thousands of miles away, mostly chilling in Okinawa. They saw the Soviets moving in and collectively panicked. It was a mad scramble. There was no plan. There had been vague talks at wartime conferences, Yalta, Potsdam, the places where world leaders gathered to carve up the globe, about a trusteeship for Korea, a sort of international training wheels period before full independence. But the details were fuzzy, like a dream you had 3 nights ago. So, in Washington, D.C., a couple of mid-level officers were tasked with figuring out what to do, right now, tonight. This, ladies and gentlemen, is where history takes a turn from grand geopolitical strategy to 2 toddlers fighting over a toy they just discovered. The sheer lack of planning for Korea's future is staggering. It's like winning a giant teddy bear at a carnival and then realizing you have no idea how to get it home. The United States had poured immense resources into figuring out what to do with post-war Germany and Japan, but Korea, it was an afterthought, a footnote in the grand saga. And now that footnote was about to become the headline. The stage was set for the most awkward co-parenting arrangement in modern history. America, striding onto the scene, adjusting its bomber jacket. All right, party's over, we did it, folks. Now what's this, a free Korea? Fantastic. We'll set them up with some free elections, a constitution, a few diners, and a deep appreciation for baseball. It'll be great. Soviet Union, already sitting in Northern Korea cleaning a rifle. Is that so? Funny. I was already here. We were thinking less baseball and more glorious collectivized agriculture under the wise guidance of the proletariat. My people are already helping them form orderly committees. America. Whoa there, Red. Hold your horses or bears. This was an Allied victory. That means we share. I see your troops are in the north, so our guys will just land in the south. We'll split the administrative duties. Temporarily, of course. Soviet Union. Temporarily. A curious word. It has a habit of becoming permanent when you are involved. But fine, you take the south. For now. But do not think for a second this means we are friends. We are simply colleagues in this liberation. America. Colleagues. Right. Just don't get any of your communism on my democracy, pal. And so it began, not with a bang, but with a deeply suspicious handshake over a nation that had no say in the matter. The Korean people, celebrating their newfound freedom, were about to discover that they had simply traded one master for 2 new, profoundly incompatible landlords who were already arguing over where to put the furniture. The awkward party was over, but the world's most dysfunctional cleanup crew had just arrived, and they were about to make a much bigger mess. So there we are, August 1945. The Soviet Union is in Northern Korea, busily setting up shop and handing out little red books, while America is still on a boat somewhere in the Pacific yelling, "Wait for us, we called shotgun." The problem was that shotgun isn't a recognized term in international law, and Soviet tanks were moving south fast. Washington, in a sudden fit of panic, realized that if they didn't do something immediately, the entirety of Korea would fall under the Soviet sphere of influence by simple virtue of showing up first. The Red Army could potentially roll all the way down to the southern port of Pusan before a single American GI even got his boots muddy. This would be a disaster for America's brand new leader of the free world marketing campaign. So, in the dead of night in a sweltering Washington, D.C., the emergency brake was pulled. 2 colonels, a young Dean Rusk and a Charles Bonesteel, were yanked into a room in the War Department. Their mission, should they choose to accept it, and they had no choice, was to come up with a dividing line for Korea, not for a permanent country, mind you. Oh no, that would be crazy. This was just a temporary, purely administrative line to determine which areas the Japanese forces would surrender to the Soviets, and which would surrender to the Americans. A logistical convenience, a placeholder. They were given all of 30 minutes to do it. Let that rattle around in your brain for a second. The fate of a 2,000-year-old culture, a nation of 30 million people, was placed in the hands of 2 mid-level army officers who had about as much time as you would take to order a pizza. They weren't experts on Korea. They hadn't spent years studying its ethnic, political, or geographical makeup. They were just 2 guys with a deadline. They frantically searched the room for a decent map. No detailed military charts, no fancy topographical surveys. What did they find? A standard issue wall map. Some sources even claim it was a National Geographic map. That's right, the future of East Asia was potentially being charted on the same kind of map that hangs in a middle school classroom, the one with the little yellow border. Their first instinct was to look for a natural boundary. A river, perhaps? A mountain range? Something that made sense, that people on the ground might recognize as a border. But Korea, inconsiderately, refused to provide one. There was no convenient geographical feature running neatly east to west across the middle of the peninsula, so they looked for the next best thing, a man-made line that was already printed on the paper, and there it was, crisp and straight, the 38th parallel north, a line of latitude. It was perfect. It was simple. And best of all, it cut the country almost exactly in half. Crucially, it also placed the capital city, Seoul, with all its infrastructure, history, and population, safely south of the line in the proposed American zone. This was a key selling point. Keeping the capital was like getting the fancy stereo system in a divorce settlement. They had no idea what this line meant on the ground. Did it cut through a village? Did it separate a farmer from his fields? Did it divide a province? Who knew? Who had time to check? It looked good on the map. It achieved the strategic objective of halting the Soviet advance, and it gave America control of the capital. Decision made. They scribbled it down, passed it up the chain of command, and it was hastily baked into General Order No. 1, the official instructions for Japan's surrender. The proposal was wired to Moscow. The Americans in the room held their breath, fully expecting the Soviets to reject it. This was a negotiation, after all. You start with an ambitious proposal, they counter with their own, and you meet somewhere in the middle. The 38th parallel was America's opening bid, a line farther north than they had any right to expect. And then, the most shocking thing happened. Stalin said yes, just like that. No counteroffer, no haggling. The Soviet Union simply accepted the 38th parallel. The Americans were stunned. They had bluffed, and the Soviets hadn't even blinked. Why? Well, Stalin likely saw it as a bargain. In exchange for this concession in Korea, the overall deal secured him other territories he wanted more, like the Kuril Islands from Japan. To him, Korea was a secondary prize, and avoiding a direct confrontation with the US over it was probably worth letting them have the southern half. So the deal was done. The line was agreed upon. A temporary measure, a simple matter of military logistics. Colonel Dean Rusk, sweating, pointing at the map. Okay, Chuck, time's up. The Soviets are basically jogging towards Seoul as we speak. What have we got? Colonel Charles Bonesteel. Rivers are a no-go, mountains are all wrong. The whole peninsula is vertical. It's terribly designed for being split horizontally. But look here. This latitude line, the big 38. Rusk. The 38th parallel. It's so arbitrary, so geometric, it has all the soul of a spreadsheet cell. Does it divide anything important? Bonesteel. It divides everything, Dean, that's the point, but it leaves Seoul on our side. The bosses will love that. We get the capital. It's a PR win. Rusk. All right, let's write it up. Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel to surrender to the Soviets, south to the Americans. We all propose it and brace for Stalin to laugh in our faces and demand the 35th. Bonesteel. Fine. Draw the line. But for the love of God, use a ruler. Let's at least maintain the illusion that this wasn't a decision made in a panic with a map from a travel magazine. And this is the central cosmic joke of the whole situation. One of the most painful, enduring, and heavily armed borders in the entire world, a line that has defined the lives of millions, was chosen by two guys in a hurry because it looked neat on a wall map. It's the geopolitical equivalent of getting a tattoo of a dragon because you saw a cool picture of one on a menu at a Chinese restaurant. No thought for the future, no understanding of the local context, just a quick, impulsive decision that seemed like a good idea after 3 cups of coffee at 2 a.m. The Koreans, of course, were not consulted. They woke up one morning to discover their country had been sliced in half by a foreign power's ruler, for reasons of foreign convenience. The temporary line was drawn. Now all America had to do was show up and hope it wouldn't become permanent. Spoiler alert, it did. So the line is on the map. It's official. The 38th parallel, a completely imaginary line of geography, is now a very real line in the sand. In the north, the Soviet Union, having been the first to arrive, is already redecorating. They move with a terrifying cold efficiency. They know exactly what they want. A friendly, stable, communist buffer state on their southeastern flank. To do this, they need a leader, a local hero they can mold and control. They go through their files and find the perfect candidate, a 33-year-old anti-Japanese guerrilla commander named Kim Il-sung. Kim was a Soviet-trained captain in the Red Army, charismatic, ruthless, and most importantly, ideologically reliable. The Soviets basically airlift him into Pyongyang, give him a slick new uniform, and present him to the Korean people as the legendary warrior who single-handedly drove out the Japanese. His actual wartime record was impressive, but the Soviets gave it the full Hollywood blockbuster treatment, complete with a massive PR campaign. They swiftly dismantled any local Korean-led governing committees that didn't align with their vision, purged landowners and anyone with pro-Japanese sympathies, and started building a new North Korean army from the ground up. They handed Kim Il-sung the keys to a brand new authoritarian state, complete with a user manual and a full armory. It was a turnkey dictatorship. Then a few weeks later, in September 1945, the Americans finally show up in the South. They roll into the port of Incheon, all confidence in chewing gum, and proceed to demonstrate that they have absolutely no idea what they are doing. While the Soviets had a clear, albeit sinister plan, the American plan was basically a shrug emoji. Their commander, General John R. Hodge, was a fine battlefield general, but a political neophyte who openly admitted he knew nothing about Korea and famously referred to the locals as the same breed of cat as the Japanese. Not a great start for your liberator. The American mission, in a nutshell, was stop communism. That was it. That was the whole memo. They weren't there to build a nation. They were there to build a dam. And in their paranoid quest to stop the red tide, they made a series of catastrophic blunders. They saw the local people's committees that had sprung up across the South and, because they had the word peoples in their name, immediately assumed they were all Soviet puppet organizations. So America's first official act as liberator was to outlaw and dissolve the fledgling, popular Korean-run governments. Their second act was even worse. Needing someone to actually run the administration, and having just banned the locals, they decided to simply keep the old Japanese colonial bureaucrats and Korean collaborators in their jobs. Imagine being liberated from your oppressors of 35 years only for the new guys to show up and say, "Hey, you know that guy who used to beat you and steal your rice for the emperor? Well, he's staying. He's got experience." The Korean people were, to put it mildly, furious. The goodwill America should have had evaporated almost overnight. With the South descending into chaos, strikes, and protests, the US realized they needed their own guy, a Korean face to put on their anti-communist project. They needed a counter Kim. After cycling through a few options, they landed on a man named Syngman Rhee. Rhee was a 70-year-old Korean nationalist who had been living in exile in the United States for most of his adult life. He had a PhD from Princeton, spoke perfect English, and, most importantly, hated communists with the passion of 1,000 burning suns. On paper, he was perfect. In reality, he was an authoritarian, stubborn, and deeply unpopular old man who had completely lost touch with the country he claimed to represent. But he was their guy. America flew him back to Korea, propped him up, and hoped for the best. This is where the whole situation becomes a tale of two dads. The Soviet Union was the strict, demanding father. It gave its son, Kim Il-sung, a clear set of rules, a powerful army, and the unwavering support needed to build a state in its own image. Kim knew exactly what was expected of him: total control, total loyalty. America, on the other hand, was the rich, neglectful dad. It gave its son, Syngman Rhee, a giant blank check in the form of economic aid, a copy of Democracy for Dummies, and then got distracted by the much bigger, more important kids' party happening over in Europe, with the Marshall Plan and the Berlin airlift. Rhee was left to his own devices, with America's only real rule being, whatever you do, don't become a communist. Soviet Union, polishing a T-34 tank. Behold. My North Korea is a model of efficiency. My Kim has organized the workers, armed the soldiers, and created a strong centralized government. He is a hero of the people. America, frantically writing a check. Oh yeah? Well, our South Korea is a marketplace of ideas, very vibrant. And our guy, Syngman Rhee, is a real Democrat, went to Princeton, you know. Very smart. Soviet Union. Your Democrat just had his political opponents thrown in jail and his police are beating up protesters. My Kim is also jailing his opponents, but at least we are honest about it. We call it a purge, not vigorous debate. America. Hey, that's just the messy, beautiful process of freedom taking root. You can't make a democratic omelet without breaking a few, dissident eggs. Look, he's not a communist, and that's the win. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go deal with Berlin. Try not to start a war while I'm gone. So the board was set. In the north, a young, Soviet-backed dictator was consolidating absolute power. In the south, an old American-backed autocrat was suppressing dissent and blaming everything on communists. This wasn't a fair fight between communism and democracy. It was a showdown between two flavors of dictatorship, each sponsored by a superpower that cared more about its own global strategy than the actual fate of the Korean people. The temporary division was starting to look awfully permanent, and the two Koreas were being raised with two completely different and utterly toxic sets of values. The kids were not all right. By 1948, the two superpower dads decided it was time for the kids to officially have their own rooms, even though they were still in the same house. The United Nations was called in to oversee elections for the whole peninsula, a lovely idea that was about as feasible as hosting a petting zoo in a piranha tank. The Soviet Union, knowing their guy wouldn't win a nationwide popularity contest, told the UN to get lost. So, elections were held only in the south. This led to the official creation of the Republic of Korea, ROK, in August 1948, with the ever-charming Syngman Rhee as its first president. Not to be outdone, the North officially declared itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, a month later, with Kim Il-sung as its premier. So now we have two Koreas, two governments, two constitutions, two armies, and two leaders, both of whom claimed, with a perfectly straight face, to be the one and only legitimate ruler of the entire peninsula. This is like two people getting divorced and both claiming they get to keep the house and the other person has to go live in the shed. It's a fundamentally unstable arrangement. With the stage set, the US and the Soviets decided it was time to make a grand exit. In late 1948, the Soviet occupation forces packed their bags and went home. The Americans followed suit in mid-1949. It was the classic parental move of, okay, we've set up your rooms, you're on your own now, don't kill each other. But the way they left was crucially different. The Soviets left behind a massive trove of military hardware, tanks, heavy artillery, aircraft, and a corps of advisors to make sure the brand new North Korean people, S-Army, KPA, knew how to use it all. They had sculpted the KPA into a formidable modern fighting force, a sharpened spear ready to be thrown. America, on the other hand, was deeply, deeply nervous about Syngman Rhee. They knew he was a hothead. Rhee was constantly giving fiery speeches about a March North campaign to forcibly reunify the country. The US was terrified that if they gave him anything more powerful than a pea shooter, he'd try it and drag them into a massive land war in Asia, the exact thing every military strategist dreads. So they intentionally kept the new Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, on a tight leash. The ROKA was a large force, but it was equipped as a light defensive constabulary. They had rifles, machine guns, and some light artillery, but no tanks, no heavy bombers, no offensive capability whatsoever. America essentially handed Rhee the keys to the house, but refused to give him the code to the gun safe. With the parents officially gone, the two kids immediately started trying to burn the house down. The years between 1948 and 1950 were not peaceful, not even close. The 38th parallel became arguably the most violent place on Earth. It was a chaotic, bloody free-for-all. Think of it as the world's most toxic sibling rivalry. The 38th parallel was a strip of tape on the floor of a shared bedroom, And both North and South Korea spent every single day seeing how far they could get away with leaning over it. There were hundreds of cross-border raids, artillery duels, and full-on battalion-sized engagements. Both sides established guerrilla movements in the other's territory. The fighting was particularly fierce around the Korean Peninsula on the west coast, a thumb of land that was mostly north of the parallel but controlled by the south. It was a constant source of friction. This wasn't a Cold War, it was a boiling hot shadow war. It was a relentless series of border pokes, each one designed to test the other's defenses and resolve. And after every single skirmish, both sides would run to their superpower sponsors. "Mom, he's touching my side of the room again," Kim would write to Stalin, pleading for the green light for a full-scale invasion to liberate the South. Rhee, meanwhile, would complain to Washington that he couldn't possibly defend himself from these provocations without tanks. And could he please have some tanks, pretty please? North and South Korea are yelling at each other across a line drawn in the dirt, the 38th parallel. "North Korea, stop sending your commandos over here. This isn't your dirt, it's my dirt." South Korea, "Oh, like your communist agitators aren't trying to start rebellions on my islands. I saw you. You fired your artillery first." North Korea, "Nuh-uh. You were building illegal fortifications. I'm the only real Korea. My dad, the Soviet one, said I'm the chosen one." South Korea, "You're a puppet. I'm the real Korea recognized by the UN. My dad, the American one, gives me way more pocket money than yours gives you. And just you wait, I'm gonna march north and wipe that smug look off your face." North Korea leans back and casually pats the side of a shiny Soviet-made T-34 tank that South Korea can't help but notice. "You in what army?" South Korea, "Shut up. This is the critical context that often gets lost. The Korean War didn't just pop into existence on June 25, 1950. The peninsula was already a powder keg. The border was a bleeding wound, with thousands of soldiers and civilians killed in these supposedly minor clashes before the main event even kicked off. It was less a sudden, unprovoked invasion, and more like two people had been having a knife fight in a phone booth for 2 years, and one of them finally decided it was time to pull out a grenade. Both Kim and Rhee were absolutely convinced that war was the only way to unify their country, and both were actively trying to start it. The only difference was that Kim's dad had given him the bigger knife, and he was just waiting for permission to use it. So we have a heavily armed North Korea, led by an ambitious Kim Il-sung, staring daggers across the 38th parallel at a lightly armed South Korea, led by a blustering Syngman Rhee. The pressure is building. Kim is absolutely convinced that the time to strike is now. He believes, with the fervent passion of a true believer, that the moment his glorious people's army crosses the border, the oppressed workers and peasants of the South will rise up, overthrow Rhee's corrupt regime, and welcome his soldiers as liberators. He envisions a swift, surgical strike, a blitzkrieg to borrow a term from some folks they had recently been fighting, that would be over and done with before Washington could even find Korea on a map again. There was just one problem. His dad wouldn't give him the car keys. Throughout 1949, Kim Il-sung was engaged in a relentless campaign of pestering Joseph Stalin. He sent telegrams, he sent envoys. He made it clear that he was ready to go, that victory was assured, and all he needed was Moscow's official blessing and a little more material support. And every single time, Stalin, the supreme overlord of the communist world, said no. Not yet. His reasoning was cold and simple. The risk was too high. The Americans, for all their blunders, still had troops in Japan. More importantly, they had a monopoly on the atomic bomb. Stalin was a chess player, not a gambler. He was not willing to risk a direct military confrontation with the United States, a potential World War III, for the sake of Korea. His main focus was on consolidating his gains in Eastern Europe. Korea was a sideshow. He told Kim to be patient, to continue funding communist guerrillas in the South, to destabilize Rhee's government from within. Basically, keep poking him, but for the love of Marx, do not start an actual war. But then, over the course of about 8 months, the entire world changed. 4 things happened that completely altered Stalin's calculation. First, in August 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its own atomic bomb. Boom. Just like that, the American nuclear monopoly was shattered. The playing field was leveled. Stalin now had his own superweapon, giving him a massive boost in confidence. He was no longer staring down a nuclear-armed opponent while he himself was empty-handed. Second, in October 1949, something even bigger happened. Mao Zedong's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War. The world's most populous nation was now the People's Republic of China. This was a monumental victory for global communism and a game-changer for North Korea. Suddenly, Kim Il-sung didn't just have a border with the Soviet Union. He had a massive, battle-hardened, ideologically aligned big brother right next door. This gave North Korea incredible strategic depth. Third, to formalize this new reality, Mao traveled to Moscow and in February 1950 signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. The communist bloc in Asia was now official, a unified front against American influence. Fourth, against this backdrop of shifting power, Kim Il-sung made a secret trip to Moscow in March 1950. This time, he wasn't just asking. He was presenting a full, detailed invasion plan. He had intelligence, timetables, and a passionate sales pitch. He assured Stalin that the war would be won in less than a month. He promised that a massive popular uprising in the South would guarantee a swift victory. He insisted, over and over, that the Americans were too slow, too disengaged, and would not intervene in time. Stalin, the cautious chess master, listened. He saw his own A-bomb. He saw a powerful new ally in China. He saw Kim's detailed plan. He weighed the risks again. And this time, the calculation came out different. The potential reward, a unified Korea, a strategic dagger pointed at Japan, a major victory for communism, now seemed to outweigh the diminished risk. He decided to let his boy take a swing, but he did it in the most brilliantly cynical way possible, in a dimly lit room in the Kremlin. Kim Il-sung, please, great comrade Stalin, the South is rotten to the core. Their army will fold like paper. One big push is all it will take. The time is now. Stalin takes a long drag from his pipe. I have told you no for a year, little Kim. My answer has always been no. Why is it different now? Kim Il-sung, everything is different. You have the bomb. Comrade Mao has all of China. Our power is at its peak. America will not dare to fight all of us. Stalin lets out a slow cloud of smoke. You are very confident. Confidence is good. Recklessness is not. Fine. You have my permission. We will supply you with everything you need. Our military advisors will finalize your plans. But listen to me very carefully. Not one Soviet soldier will set foot on Korean soil. This will be your war, and it comes with one very important condition. Kim Il-sung, anything, Comrade Stalin. Stalin, you must go to Beijing. You must present your plan to Mao Zedong. He must agree to it completely. If, and I say if, the Americans are foolish enough to intervene, you will not be looking to Moscow for help. You will be looking to Beijing. China will be your reserve. Do you understand? This must be their responsibility, not mine. This was Stalin's masterstroke. He was sanctioning the invasion, but he was outsourcing the risk. He was placing a bet on Kim, but he was making Mao co-sign the loan. If the invasion succeeded, it was a victory for the whole communist world, and by extension, for him. If it failed, and the Americans got involved, it would be China's problem to solve, bogging them down and making them even more dependent on the Soviet Union. It was a win-win for Moscow. Kim, ecstatic at finally getting the green light, immediately flew to Beijing. Mao, eager to prove China's revolutionary credentials and not wanting to look weak in front of his communist allies, gave his full support. The permission slip was co-signed. All the lights were green. The war was on. All right, so the plan is set. Kim has his permission slip co-signed by Stalin and Mao. The North Korean People's Army is oiled, fueled, and itching for a fight. They are crouched at the starting line, just waiting for the final signal. The only thing that could possibly give them pause is the great unknown. What would America do? Sure, Kim had promised Stalin that the US wouldn't intervene, but that was just a sales pitch. In the back of everyone ES mind in the communist bloc was the terrifying possibility that an invasion of the South might trigger a massive, immediate, and overwhelming American response. The US was, after all, the world's biggest, baddest superpower, and poking it was generally considered a bad idea. And then, America itself cleared its throat, stepped up to a podium, and removed any lingering doubt. The year is 1950. The Cold War is getting very real, and the Truman administration is taking a beating at home. They'd just lost China, a phrase that makes it sound like they left it on the bus, and anti-communist hysteria was starting to bubble over. Senators like Joseph McCarthy were beginning to claim the State Department was full of communist agents. In this tense atmosphere, the Secretary of State, a man named Dean Acheson, decided he needed to give a big, important speech to clarify American foreign policy in Asia. Acheson was the dictionary definition of an East Coast elite: impeccably tailored suit, magnificent mustache, and a level of intellectual confidence that could border on arrogance. On January 12, 1950, he stood before the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. to lay it all out. The goal of the speech was to project strength and clarity, to draw a firm line in the sand. And that's exactly what he did. He described what he called America's defensive perimeter in the Pacific. This was the list of places, he explained, that were so vital to U.S. interests that any attack on them would be met with immediate American military force. He traced this line with his words. It ran from the Aleutian Islands off of Alaska, down through Japan, the crown jewel of America's post-war project, then through the Ryukyu Islands, which included the massive U.S. base at Okinawa, and culminated in the Philippines. This was the fortress. This was the red line. And what about the places not on that list? Well, in one of the most famously catastrophic omissions in diplomatic history, Dean Acheson's defensive perimeter conspicuously leapfrogged right over Korea. He also left out Taiwan, where the defeated Chinese nationalists had fled. He essentially held up a map of Asia for the whole world to see and pointed to South Korea and said, "This bit here, not in the fortress." He did add a wishy-washy sentence about how any country left outside the perimeter that got attacked would have to rely on the civilized world under the Charter of the United Nations. This was diplomatic speak for, "You're on your own, but maybe our book club will write a strongly worded letter about it." In Washington, the speech barely made a ripple. It was seen as a simple, sober statement of the obvious. Of course, Japan was more important than Korea. It was just articulating the existing Pentagon strategy. But in Pyongyang, Moscow, and Beijing, they weren't just listening, they were taking notes. They heard Acheson's carefully chosen words not as a nuanced policy statement, but as a giant flashing neon green light. For Kim Il-sung, it was the ultimate vindication. He could now go back to his patrons and say, "See, I told you so. The Americans just said it themselves. They don't care about South Korea." It erased any final shreds of doubt. It confirmed his core belief that he could overrun the South before the US could be bothered to get involved. Stalin, ever the cautious one, saw this as the Americans publicly declaring their hand, and it was a weak one. Why would they say this if they weren't serious? The path to invasion now seemed not just clear, but completely unopposed by the only power on Earth that could realistically stop it. In Kim Il-sung's command center, a radio is crackling with a report on Acheson's speech. Kim is vibrating with excitement. Kim Il-sung pacing back and forth. "It's perfect." It is more than perfect. He literally drew a picture for us and left us out of it. Soviet military advisor, calmly reading a report. "It is an interesting rhetorical choice, Comrade Premier, to announce to your enemies which of your friends you will not be defending." Kim Il-sung. Interesting? It's a gift from the heavens, a gift from the great dialectical process of history. The American imperialists are arrogant, they are decadent, they have announced their own weakness for the world to hear. Soviet military advisor, or it is a trap. Kim Il-sung. Nonsense. They are capitalists. They only care about money. Japan is where the money is. Korea is a backwater to them. Acheson just confirmed it. This removes the last obstacle, the final excuse for inaction. The time for hesitation is over. Send the final orders to the divisions at the border. History is calling. This is the spectacular irony of the whole affair. Acheson's speech wasn't intended as an invitation to invade. It was a bureaucratic attempt to manage resources and define priorities. But in the hypersensitive, paranoid echo chamber of the Cold War, words have immense power. Nuance is the first casualty. America thought it was speaking to its own budget committees and political allies, but it was also speaking directly to its adversaries. And those adversaries heard exactly what they wanted to hear: that the back door was unlocked, the alarm was off, and nobody was home. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place, and it had been handed to them by the enemy itself. The countdown to war had just jumped to its final seconds. The stage is set. The actors are in position. The audience, the rest of the world, is looking the other way. In the days leading up to the invasion, North Korea puts on a masterful piece of political theater. They flood the airwaves and press with peace overtures, proposing a pan-Korean unification conference and calling for general elections across the entire peninsula. It was a brilliant, cynical smokescreen, designed to paint themselves as the reasonable party and lull the South into a false sense of security. It worked beautifully. The South Korean military, accustomed to the years of low-level border skirmishes, saw nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, on the eve of the invasion, with the weather looking good, a huge portion of the Republic of Korea Army was given weekend leave. Intelligence reports of a massive military buildup in the north were largely dismissed as just more saber-rattling. Then, at approximately 4:40 a.m. on the rainy Sunday morning of June 25, 1950, the peace overtures came to an abrupt and very loud end. All along the 38th parallel, a storm of steel erupted. Thousands of North Korean artillery pieces, gifts from the Soviet Union, opened up in a coordinated, terrifying barrage. The shells rained down on the unprepared ROK Army positions, shattering bunkers, cutting communication lines and turning the pre-dawn calm into a hellscape of noise and fire. This was not another border poke. This was the real thing. And before the dazed and bleeding defenders could even figure out what was happening, the main attack began. 135,000 soldiers of the North Korean People's Army, backed by over 150 Soviet-made T-34 tanks, crashed south across the parallel in a multi-pronged assault. They didn't just cross the line, they obliterated it. They came through the wall like the Kool-Aid Man, a massive, unstoppable force of red Kool-Aid and revolutionary fervor. What followed was not a battle. It was a rout. The ROK soldiers at the front lines fought bravely, but bravery is no match for a 32-ton tank when the biggest weapon you have is a faulty bazooka whose rockets just bounce off the armor. The T-34 was a monster, a steel beast that the Southerners had no answer for. Division after division of the ROK Army, under-equipped and caught completely by surprise, simply disintegrated. Coordinated resistance collapsed into individual pockets of doomed last stands and a frantic, disorganized retreat. The North Korean invasion plan, meticulously crafted by their Soviet advisors, was working to perfection. The main KPA columns drove relentlessly toward their primary objective, the capital city of Seoul. The Ri government, which had talked so tough for so long about marching north, panicked. Instead of organizing a defense, Syngman Rhee and his cabinet packed their bags and fled south, abandoning the city. In one of the most infamous and cowardly acts of the war, the retreating southern leadership ordered the main bridges over the Han River in Seoul to be blown up to slow the northern advance. They detonated the charges while the bridges were still packed with thousands of fleeing refugees and their own retreating ROK soldiers, sending hundreds, perhaps thousands, to their deaths. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership that shattered the morale of what was left of their army. Just 3 days after the invasion began, on June 28th, the victorious soldiers of the KPA rolled into the battered streets of Seoul. Kim Il-sung's gamble had paid off spectacularly. He had seized the enemy's capital in 72 hours. The Southern Army was in ruins. The government was in exile. From his command post in Pyongyang, it must have looked like total victory was just days away. The rapid collapse he had promised Stalin was happening right on schedule. The surprise party was a smashing success. The guest of honor was on the run, and it seemed no one was coming to call the cops. 2 ROK soldiers huddle in a shallow foxhole as shells explode around them. Soldier 1. This isn't a skirmish, this is everything. Soldier 2. Command isn't answering, the line's dead. What are our orders? The ground begins to tremble. A massive T-34 tank smashes through a nearby tree line, its machine gun blazing. Soldier 1. Sweet mother of mercy, what is that thing? Soldier 2. It's one of theirs. A tank. Get the rocket launcher. A soldier nearby fires a 2.36-inch bazooka. The rocket zips through the air and strikes the tank's turret with a loud clang, then harmlessly falls to the ground. The tank, if it could speak, it would let out a deep, bored, metallic sigh. Are you finished? Soldier 1. I propose a strategic advance to the rear, immediately. Soldier 2. I second the proposal. Go. This was the absolute apex of North Korea's power. Their army looked invincible. Their plan was flawless. Their enemy was broken. To everyone on the ground, and especially to the leaders in Pyongyang, the war for Korean unification was already over. All that was left was the mopping up. They had thrown a surprise party, and the only thing they didn't account for was that one of the neighbors, the big one from across the ocean, was about to get very, very angry about the noise. The news of a full-scale invasion of South Korea hit Washington, D.C. on a Saturday night. In the era before 24-hour news and the internet, the initial reports were patchy, but they were bad enough to send the entire American foreign policy establishment into a 5-alarm panic. President Harry S. Truman was roused at his home in Missouri. His reaction was visceral and immediate. Truman was a man who saw the world in stark, uncomplicated terms of right and wrong, and this was, to him, unambiguously wrong. He saw the invasion not as a minor regional squabble, but as a direct challenge to the entire post-World War II order that America had just spent trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives to build. In the minds of Truman and his advisors, this had Joseph Stalin's fingerprints all over it. They saw a direct parallel to the 1930s, Hitler testing the will of the international community in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. The word on everyone's lips was appeasement. They had seen what happened when you let a dictator get away with gobbling up a small country because it seemed easier than starting a fight. It didn't lead to peace. It led to a bigger, more catastrophic war down the road. This, they believed, was the first move in a global communist offensive. If South Korea fell, what was next? Japan? The Philippines? West Berlin? Truman famously told his advisors, "By God, I'm going to let them have it." The decision was made almost instantly. America was not going to let South Korea fall. They were going to intervene. But how? They couldn't just unilaterally declare war on North Korea. That would look like old-fashioned imperialism, and it would put them in direct opposition to the Soviets and Chinese. They needed a better way. They needed moral authority. They needed a posse. And lucky for them, they had just built the perfect organization for forming a global posse, the United Nations. The UN was brand new, barely 5 years old, and this was going to be its first major test. It was created for precisely this reason, to deal with acts of international aggression. So, America immediately ran to the UN headquarters in New York, pointed a finger at North Korea, and yelled, "He started it." They demanded an emergency meeting of the most powerful body in the UN, the Security Council. On June 25th, the Council passed Resolution 82, which condemned the North Korean invasion and demanded they pull their troops back. The North Koreans, who were busy steamrolling their way to Seoul, ignored it. So 2 days later, on June 27th, the US came back with a much bigger, much stronger resolution. This one, Resolution 83, called on all UN member states to furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. This was it. This was the resolution that authorized war. Now, any student of the UN knows about the veto. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, the UK, France, China, and the Soviet Union, each have the power to single-handedly veto any resolution they don't like. The invasion was a Soviet-backed plan. So naturally, the Soviet ambassador was going to raise his hand, say Nayet, and that would be the end of that, right? Wrong. In one of the most stunningly self-defeating diplomatic blunders of the 20th century, the Soviet Union wasn't there. They were in the middle of a massive temper tantrum. For the past several months, the Soviet ambassador, Yakov Malik, had been boycotting all Security Council meetings. Why? Because the UN was still recognizing the defeated nationalist government in Taiwan as the legitimate government of China, and refused to give the seat to Mao Zedong's new Communist People's Republic. So, in protest, the Soviets took their ball and went home. Stalin apparently believed that any major UN decision made without his participation would be seen as illegitimate. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Inside the UN Security Council chamber, America is red-faced and pounding the table. America, this is an outrage, a blatant violation of international law. One of our, new friends, South Korea, has been viciously attacked. We must act. We must form an international coalition to restore order. Britain, adjusting his monocle. Indeed, a shocking breach of decorum. We stand with our American friends. It's simply not cricket. France, this aggression, it is, how you say, not good. We will vote yes, provided it does not require us to do too much. America. Excellent. All in favor of creating a UN military force to go and punch a bully in the nose? Hands go up around the table. Everyone nervously glances at the Soviet Union's chair, which is conspicuously empty. Britain. Well, that's that then. Our Soviet colleague seems to be running late today. Terribly late, in fact. What a shame. He's missed the vote. Motion carries. America. Grinning. Great. The UN has spoken. Now let's go get our helmets. Because the Soviet chair was empty, there was no one to cast the veto. The resolution passed. Just like that, the United States had its international mandate. This wasn't going to be an American war. It was going to be a UN police action. The blue and white flag of the United Nations would fly alongside the stars and stripes. It was a massive diplomatic victory that gave the US the perfect moral and legal cover to send its military halfway around the world. All because the one person who could have stopped them had decided to boycott school that day out of spite. Stalin's gambit had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable, and Truman now had everything he needed to turn the tide. So the UN posse has been formed. The cavalry is coming. In Tokyo, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, the living legend, the man with the sunglasses and the corncob pipe, General Douglas MacArthur, is put in charge of the whole operation. The plan is simple. Get American troops from their cushy occupation duties in Japan over to Korea as fast as possible to stop the bleeding. The problem was that these weren't the battle-hardened GIs of 1945. These were soldiers who had grown soft. They were garrison troops, more accustomed to chasing local Japanese girls and drinking beer than fighting a determined tank-led army. They were, in the words of one general, fat and happy. And they were about to get a very rude awakening. In a desperate bid to just slow down the North Korean juggernaut, the 1st American unit was thrown into the fray. It was a small, understrength battalion of the 24th Infantry Division, codenamed Task Force Smith. On July 5th, these 540 men, armed with little more than rifles, a couple of mortars, and some brand new, supposedly tank-killing bazookas, set up a roadblock near the town of Osan. They were the speed bump. They were confident, cocky even. They were the United States Army. They were about to hold the line against some peasant army. Then a column of 33 North Korean T-34 tanks came rumbling down the road towards them. The men of Task Force Smith opened fire. Their 2.36-inch bazookas, which had been perfectly adequate against German tanks 5 years earlier, proved utterly useless against the thick, sloped armor of the Soviet-built T-34s. The rockets literally bounced off. The North Koreans, probably more confused than anything else, just kept rolling forward, their machine guns blazing, and smashed right through the American position. Outflanked, outgunned, and completely demoralized, Task Force Smith broke and ran, suffering over 150 casualties in the first disastrous encounter between the two armies. The shattering of Task Force Smith was a microcosm of the next 6 weeks. It was a nightmare. The US and the remnants of the Iraq army would try to form a defensive line along a river or in a mountain pass, and the KPA would just smash it or flow around it. The Americans were fighting a 20th century war with leftover 1940s equipment against an enemy who had the absolute best 1950s Soviet gear. It was a continuous, brutal fighting retreat down the entire length of the Korean Peninsula. The official military term for this is trading space for time. But for the soldiers on the ground during the brutally hot and humid summer of 1950, it just felt like losing. By the beginning of August, they had run out of space to trade. The UN forces, which was still just a fancy name for a bunch of Americans and the battered ROK army, had been pushed into the absolute southeastern corner of the peninsula. They were trapped in a tight, 140-mile-long defensive box with their backs to the Sea of Japan. This desperate last-ditch foothold became known as the Pusan Perimeter. The port city of Pusan, inside the perimeter, became the most important place in the world. It was the only functioning deep-water port they had left, the single bottleneck through which every soldier, every bullet, every tank, and every can of beans had to flow into the country. If Pusan fell, the war was over. The UN army would be annihilated or forced into a humiliating evacuation from the beaches. This was it, the absolute low point. The entire country of South Korea, which they had come to save, had been condensed into a tiny, bloody rectangle. The commander of the U.S. 8th Army, General Walton Walker, issued a now famous order to his men. There will be no more retreating. There is no line behind us to which we can retreat. We are going to fight it out here and now. We are going to hold this line. We are going to win. It was a classic stand or die moment. A young, terrified U.S. private is diving into a foxhole next to a weary ROK sergeant. U.S. private, they're everywhere. We set up a roadblock and they just went around it. We blew a bridge, and they drove their tanks right through the river. Don't these guys ever stop? ROK sergeant takes a sip of water, doesn't look up. No, U.S. private. And the tanks, God, the tanks. It's like they're invincible. We were told we were the best equipped army in the world. ROK sergeant, you were told a story. We have been living the reality. For a month we fight, we run. We run, we fight. Welcome to the retreat. U.S. private, but where do we retreat to? There's nothing behind us but the ocean. ROK sergeant finally looks at him. Exactly. Now stop talking and start digging. The North Koreans knew this was their chance. They threw everything they had at the Pusan perimeter throughout August and early September, launching a series of massive, desperate human wave attacks known as the Great Naktong Offensive. The fighting was savage, some of the most brutal of the entire war. But inside the perimeter, the UN forces finally had an advantage. Their supply lines were short. They could shift troops quickly to plug any gaps. And crucially, American air power from carriers and bases in Japan could finally dominate the sky over the small battlefield. For weeks the line bent, but it didn't break. The UN forces were hanging on by their fingernails, praying for a miracle. And back in Tokyo, General MacArthur was busy planning one. So the situation is grim. The UN forces are crammed into the Pusan perimeter, a tiny corner of Korea, fighting for their lives. It's a bloody, brutal stalemate. They're holding, but just barely. A frontal assault to break out of the perimeter would be a meat grinder, a head-on collision with the bulk of the North Korean army. General Walton Walker, the commander on the ground, was preparing for exactly that, but it was going to be ugly. But hundreds of miles away in his Tokyo headquarters, the Grand Supreme Commander of the whole show, General Douglas MacArthur, was having none of it. Frontal assaults were for suckers. They were brutish, unimaginative, and worst of all, they lacked flair. MacArthur, a man whose ego had its own gravitational pull, didn't do meat grinders. He did lightning bolts. He wanted a masterstroke. He wanted a knockout punch that would not only win the war, but would also look amazing in the history books, preferably with his picture next to it. He came up with a plan so audacious, so risky, and so monumentally insane that everyone in the Pentagon thought he had lost his mind. The plan was called Operation Chromite. The target was Incheon. The idea was simple genius. Instead of pushing from the front, he would stage a massive amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. From there, the the UN forces could quickly recapture the nearby capital of Seoul, severing the main supply and communication lines of the North Korean army that was massed down south at Busan. This would effectively trap the entire KPA, cutting them off from their supplies and reinforcements. They would wither on the vine, caught between the hammer of the Incheon landing force and the anvil of the 8th Army breaking out from Busan. It was a beautiful, elegant plan. There was just one tiny little problem. Incheon was, by every objective military metric, the worst possible place on the entire Korean Peninsula, and perhaps the entire planet, to stage an amphibious invasion. First, the tides. Incheon has one of the most extreme tidal ranges in the world, regularly seeing differences of over 30 feet between high and low tide. This meant that for most of the day, the harbor wasn't a harbor at all. It was a gigantic, impassable mudflat, miles wide. Warships and landing craft could only get near the city for a couple of hours during the absolute peak of high tide. This gave the invaders a ridiculously small window to land tens of thousands of men. And since tides are predictable, the North Koreans would know the exact day and the exact hour of any potential attack. Second, the approach. There were no wide-open sea lanes to the port. The only way in was through a series of long, narrow, and treacherous channels which the North Koreans could easily mine and cover with artillery from the surrounding islands. It was a death trap. Third, the beach. Incheon didn't have a beach. You know, the sandy kind you see in movies about D-Day. It didn't have that. What it had were massive 12-foot-high stone seawalls. The plan called for the U.S. Marines to literally drive their landing craft up to these walls and scale them with wooden ladders, like they were storming a medieval castle, all while under machine gun fire. The top brass at the Pentagon, the Navy, and the Marine Corps were absolutely horrified. They saw the plan and collectively had a heart attack. They sent a delegation to Tokyo to try and talk some sense into the old man. They laid out all the logical, rational, data-driven reasons why the Incheon landing was a suicide mission. They proposed alternate landing sites that were safer, easier, and made infinitely more military sense. In a tense meeting room in Tokyo, maps are everywhere. MacArthur is calmly smoking his pipe. Navy Admiral Forrest Sherman: "General, I've crunched the numbers. We have a 3-hour window on September 15th. If there's a storm, if a single ship gets stuck in the channel, if the enemy has just one well-placed artillery battery, the entire landing force will be stranded on the mudflats for 12 hours. They will be annihilated. Marine General Lemuel Shepard." "And the seawalls, sir?" "We're talking about asking Marines to climb ladders into a defended city. The casualty projections are unacceptable. This violates every lesson we learned in the Pacific." MacArthur stands up, begins to pace. "Gentlemen, your objections are all valid. They are the reasons a timid commander would never dream of attempting this. And that is precisely why it will be a success." The room falls silent. "MacArthur, the enemy commander in Pyongyang is not a fool. He has studied the same textbooks you have. He knows Incheon is a death trap. He knows all the reasons we should not come there. Therefore, he will not believe we are coming. He will leave it lightly defended. The sheer impossibility of it is our greatest weapon. The enemy will expect a landing at a logical place, but I am not a logical commander. I am a victorious one. We will land at Incheon, and I will personally lead the troops ashore." And with that, he won them over. He delivered a masterful 75-minute performance, a symphony of rhetoric, patriotism, and unshakable self-belief. He mesmerized the room. The sheer force of his personality, the weight of his legendary reputation, and the power of his charisma steamrolled all of their perfectly logical objections. They left the meeting shaking their heads, still convinced the plan was insane, but now also convinced that maybe, just maybe, this crazy old man could actually pull it off. The bet wasn't on the plan anymore. The bet was on MacArthur himself. The world's most insane beach party was a go. The date is set, September 15th, 1950. The day with the highest tides, the only day the insane beach party can happen. In the weeks leading up to it, a vast armada of over 260 warships carrying 75,000 soldiers and Marines, the newly formed X-Corps, secretly gathers and steams towards Korea. It is a monumental logistical feat, pulling troops and ships from all over the Pacific. All the while, MacArthur does everything he can to sell the idea that he is, in fact, not crazy enough to attack Incheon. UN bombers pound other potential landing sites. The Navy conducts mock bombardments up and down the coast. A joint US-British Special Forces team even conducts a noisy raid on the port of Kunsan, the logical landing spot, just to draw the enemy's attention. The North Koreans took the bait, moving precious troops to defend Kunsan, leaving Incheon, the impossible target, with only a skeleton crew of defenders. At dawn on September 15th, the first phase began. U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Wolmi-do, a small island fortress that acted as the cork in the bottle of Incheon Harbor. The pre-landing naval bombardment had been so intense that the North Korean defenders were mostly dazed, shell-shocked, and in no condition to put up a fight. The island was secured in under 2 hours. The first part of the gamble had paid off. Incheon was indeed lightly defended. But the main event had to wait for the evening high tide. For hours, the invasion fleet sat and waited, a massive, visible target, praying the enemy wouldn't figure out what was happening and rush in reinforcements. Then, as the sun began to set, the tide swelled, and the main assault went in. It was organized chaos. Hundreds of landing craft churned through the narrow channel, heading straight for the city's waterfront and those dreaded seawalls. The Marines had brought specially constructed scaling ladders which they slammed against the stone walls as they came under fire. It was a surreal, anachronistic sight. 20th century soldiers using medieval siege tactics. But it worked. The defenders were too few and too shocked to mount a coherent defense. The Marines clawed their way over the walls, established a beachhead, and began to fight their way into the city. By midnight, the port of Incheon was firmly in UN hands. The impossible had been achieved. The success was breathtakingly swift. In the days that followed, a torrent of men, tanks, and supplies poured into the newly captured port. The Marines didn't linger. They immediately broke out and began a lightning drive inland. On September 17th, they captured Kimpo Airfield, the best in all of Korea, giving the UN complete air supremacy over the battlefield. Next, they turned their sights on the capital, Seoul. The news of the landing hit the North Korean high command like a physical blow. They were completely, totally, and utterly bamboozled. Their entire military strategy was predicated on the final, glorious capture of Pusan. Almost every single one of their battle-hardened divisions was committed to the fight in the far south, hundreds of miles away. They had no strategic reserve of any significance near their own capital, and now, as if by magic, a massive, modern enemy army had appeared in their rear, sitting squarely on top of their main supply lines. It was a strategic catastrophe of the highest order. This was the behind-the-back, half-court, buzzer-beater shot of the war. For 2.5 months, the UN team had been getting routed. They were down by 50 points, trapped in their own end zone with seconds left on the clock. And then MacArthur, the team's aging, flamboyant superstar, launched a Hail Mary pass that sailed the length of the entire field and landed perfectly for a touchdown. The entire momentum of the war, which had been so crushingly one-sided, was reversed in a single, brilliant 24-hour period in a stuffy North Korean command bunker on the Pusan front. KPA General 1. Our offensive is stalling, but their line is breaking. One more push. I want the 3rd Division to attack the American 25th at Masan with everything they have. Political officer rushes in, his face pale, waving a piece of paper. General, urgent dispatch from Pyongyang. PA General 1. What is it now? More reports of a landing at Kunsan? I told you, it is a diversion. Ignore it and focus on the final victory here. Political officer. No, Comrade General. It is not Kunsan. The Americans. They have landed an entire army at Incheon. The general stares, uncomprehending. KPA General 1. Incheon. That is not possible. The tides, the seawalls. It is a staff college fantasy. This is a mistake. It must be a lie from the American propagandists. Political officer. It is confirmed. They hold the port. They are already advancing on Kimpo Airfield. Our supply lines. They are cut. The general slowly turns to the giant map on the wall, his finger tracing the single road leading from the north all the way down to his army's position. He then places his finger on Incheon, right next to that road. The color drains from his face. KPA General 1. Get me Pyongyang. Get me anyone. We are trapped. The Incheon landing was an absolute triumph of audacity over conventional wisdom. For MacArthur, it was perhaps the most brilliant moment of his entire career, a vindication of his own self-proclaimed genius. For the soldiers and Marines of the X-Corps, it was a hard-fought and stunning victory. And for the North Korean People's Army, happily planning the final destruction of their enemies in the south, it was the sound of a steel door slamming shut behind them. The Incheon landing wasn't just a pebble in the pond, it was a meteor strike. The strategic shockwave it created instantly shattered the North Korean People's Army. In the south, trapped between the hammer of the newly landed X-Corps and the anvil of the 8th Army now breaking out of Pusan, the KPA simply ceased to exist. What had been a disciplined, conquering army just days before devolved into a panicked, disorganized mob. They abandoned their priceless Soviet-supplied heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, and fled north on foot, trying to snake their way through the mountains. UN forces, now masters of the roads and the sky, hunted them relentlessly. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The mighty KPA, the army that had conquered 90% of South Korea, was annihilated as a fighting force. While this rout was happening in the south, MacArthur's Marines were fighting a bloody, street-by-street battle for Seoul. The North Koreans, with their backs to the wall, defended the capital with suicidal ferocity. The fighting was intense and costly, leveling huge swathes of the ancient city. But the outcome was never in doubt. On September 29, 1950, General MacArthur staged a grand theatrical ceremony to formally hand the liberated, smoldering ruins of Seoul back to President Syngman Rhee. For all intents and purposes, the war was over. The UN had accomplished its mission. This is the point where things should have stopped. The original UN Security Council resolution, the entire legal and moral justification for the intervention, was to repel the armed attack on South Korea and restore its security. Mission accomplished. The North Koreans were routed, the 38th parallel was secure, and the Republic of Korea was saved. This was the moment to declare victory, go home, and pop the champagne. But victory, it turns out, is a hell of a drug. The sheer, stunning success of the Incheon landing had created a sense of euphoria, of invincibility in Washington and at the UN. After the humiliating retreats of the summer, this felt incredible. Why stop now? Why let the aggressors get away with it? Why leave this hostile, aggressive North Korean state on the border, free to rearm and try again in a few years? The thinking in the White House shifted dramatically. The limited objective of containment was suddenly replaced by the much grander, much more ambitious goal of rollback. The new plan was to destroy the North Korean regime entirely and forcibly unify Korea under the pro-Western Syngman Rhee. The temporary line drawn in crayon by two colonels 5 years earlier, the very line whose violation had started this whole bloody affair, was now seen as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. It was a temporary suggestion, a geographical footnote that had outlived its usefulness. President Truman, riding a wave of public support and eager to score a major Cold War victory, gave MacArthur the green light. The UN, largely led by the triumphant United States, passed a new resolution that vaguely authorized the creation of a unified, independent, and democratic Korea. This was all the justification MacArthur needed. The police action to save South Korea was officially over. The invasion of North Korea was about to begin. On October 1st, South Korean troops, eager for revenge, surged across the 38th parallel. A week later, on October 7th, the American-led UN forces followed in massive numbers. They poured into North Korea, with MacArthur confidently predicting that the war would be over by Thanksgiving and the boys would be home for Christmas. The remnants of the KPA offered little resistance. The advance was more of a road march than a battle. On October 19th, UN forces captured the northern capital of Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung and what was left of his government had already fled north, towards the border with China, a scene in the Oval Office. President Truman, "By God, we did it. We ran them all the way back to their side of the playground. MacArthur is a genius, a cautious aide. An incredible victory, Mr. President. The mission is a complete success." General MacArthur is requesting clarification on his orders now that he has reached the 38th parallel. Truman, clarification? What's to clarify? Tell him to keep going. Don't let them get away. Cautious aide, sir, to be clear, that would mean crossing into North Korean territory. It would change the nature of the conflict from a defense of an ally to an invasion. We've also received a rather stern warning from the Chinese via the Indian ambassador. They said they would not stand idly by if we crossed the parallel. Truman, waving a dismissive hand. The Chinese are just making noise for their Soviet friends. They're bluffing. They're exhausted from their civil war. What are they going to do, throw rocks at our tanks? Tell Doug to keep rolling. Let's finish this thing for good. This was the pivot point, the moment of supreme hubris. High on the fumes of a brilliant victory, America decided to double its bet. They had won the war they had set out to fight, and in their arrogance they decided to start an entirely new one, a war of conquest. They were no longer the rescuers, they were the invaders. And as their armies pushed deeper and deeper into North Korea, getting ever closer to the Chinese border, they were blissfully unaware that they were marching straight towards a cliff, led by a general who couldn't see it, and a president who refused to believe it was there. As the triumphant UN forces blew past the 38th parallel and drove deep into North Korea, a new, much larger, and infinitely more dangerous player was watching from the sidelines with growing anxiety. This wasn't a game to them. This was an existential threat materializing on their front porch. That player was the brand new People's Republic of China. To understand what happens next, you have to understand China's mindset in 1950. Mao Zedong's communist government was barely a year old. They had just won a decades-long, unimaginably brutal civil war. The country was in ruins, exhausted, and desperately needed a period of peace to consolidate power and rebuild. The absolute last thing on earth Mao wanted was to get into a shooting war with the most powerful and technologically advanced military on the planet, the United States. But there was one thing he wanted even less: an American army camped out on his border. The border between North Korea and China is a river called the Yalu. For centuries, Chinese strategists have viewed the Korean Peninsula as a dagger pointed at the heart of China. This wasn't some abstract theory. It was recent, painful history. They had just watched the Japanese Empire use Korea as a staging ground to invade and brutalize Manchuria and the rest of China in the 1930s and 40s. Now they were watching MacArthur's army, which they saw as the spearhead of aggressive American imperialism, marching up that same invasion corridor. To Mao, allowing the Americans to conquer North Korea would be like Mexico, allowing a massive Soviet army to set up bases along the Rio Grande. It was a national security threat that simply could not be tolerated. Manchuria, the region just across the Yalu, was China's industrial heartland, and an American presence there would put it all under threat. So China started sending warnings. They weren't subtle, but because the US and the new communist China didn't have diplomatic relations, they had to pass the message through a third party. They chose the Indian ambassador in Beijing, a man named K.M. Panikkar. The Chinese foreign minister, the suave and brilliant Zhou Enlai, summoned Panikkar for a dramatic midnight meeting. He looked him in the eye and stated, in no uncertain terms, that if US-led UN troops, not South Koreans but Americans, crossed the 38th parallel, China would enter the war. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. A red line. Panikkar dutifully relayed this message to the Americans, and the Americans laughed it off. They were completely convinced it was a bluff. In Washington and in MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, the consensus was the same. China was weak, China was bluffing. They were just trying to intimidate the UN. MacArthur's own intelligence chief, the deeply sycophantic General Charles Willoughby, assured him that China was in no position to intervene and had no intention of doing so. MacArthur, whose ego had now expanded to fill the entire Pacific Ocean, told President Truman that if the Chinese did try to intervene, it would be the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. He saw them as nothing more than a peasant army that would be no match for his modern air-supported forces. The UN forces kept pushing north, so China escalated its warnings. They started broadcasting them on the radio. They began to secretly move hundreds of thousands of their best, most battle-hardened troops from their civil war, the People's Volunteer Army, they would be called, up to the Manchurian border. And yet, the UN advance continued, a great blue and white arrow on the map, pushing relentlessly towards the Yalu River. China is standing on its front porch. America, personified by General MacArthur on a giant riding lawnmower, is cheerfully mowing his way through North Korea's lawn, getting closer and closer to China's prize-winning garden. China, shouting from the porch, "Hey, you! That's far enough. Don't you come any closer to my property line." MacArthur can't hear over the engine, just gives a friendly wave, and keeps mowing. China sends the neighborhood's neutral messenger boy, India, over to deliver a note. India, "Excuse me, sir. China says if your lawnmower crosses that little sprinkler line over there, he's going to come over here and, well, it won't be pretty." MacArthur pats India on the head. "Tell old man China not to worry his head. It's a bluff, he's all talk. We'll be done here in a minute, and then we're having a big Thanksgiving dinner. Want to come?" China, seeing the lawnmower is now just feet from its border, goes back inside and quietly begins loading a very large shotgun. This was a colossal, catastrophic failure of imagination. The American leadership was so blinded by the reflected glory of their own recent victory at Incheon that they were incapable of seeing the situation from their adversary's perspective. They projected their own logic onto China, assuming that no rational leader would risk a war they couldn't possibly win. But Mao wasn't operating on their logic. He was operating on the logic of national survival, revolutionary credibility, and a deep historical fear of invasion. The warnings were not a bluff. They were a promise. And as the lead elements of the UN forces approached the Yalu River in late October, they were about to discover that the grumpy neighbor on the porch wasn't just yelling. He had an army of 300,000 men hiding in the bushes. By late November 1950, the UN war machine was rolling with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. The troops were spread out across the top of North Korea in two main prongs, the 8th Army in the west and the X-Corps in the east, separated by a huge, impassable spine of mountains. It was a tactically risky deployment, but General MacArthur was not a man troubled by risk. He was on the cusp of total victory. On November 24th, he flew to the front to officially launch what he called the Home by Christmas Offensive. He told the press, with his signature flair, "The boys will be home for Christmas." The plan was to have his armies drive the final few miles to the Yalu River, mop up the last pathetic remnants of the North Korean army, and end the war. The mood was triumphant, bordering on festive. What MacArthur and his entire command did not know was that for the past month, they had been marching into the largest and most brilliantly disguised ambush in modern military history. While the UN forces were advancing up the roads, celebrating their easy victories, something incredible was happening in the desolate frozen mountains all around them. Under the cover of darkness, night after night, over 300,000 soldiers of the Chinese army had been secretly crossing the frozen Yalu River from Manchuria into North Korea. These were not peasant conscripts. These were the elite, battle-hardened veterans of the 4th Field Army, the toughest soldiers Mao had. They were masters of camouflage and night movement. They marched only at night, hiding in forests and gullies during the day, completely invisible to the American reconnaissance planes that flew overhead. They inserted themselves like ghosts into the vast mountain range that separated MacArthur's two armies, silently taking up positions on the flanks of the overstretched and blissfully unaware UN columns. The Chinese had actually fired a warning shot a few weeks earlier. In late October, they had launched a brief, sharp attack on some of the lead South Korean and American units, hit them hard, and then just as quickly vanished back into the mountains. This should have been the moment of revelation, the moment that changed everything. But MacArthur's headquarters, in a fit of wishful thinking, completely misinterpreted the event. They refused to believe it was a major intervention. They reported to Washington that it was probably just a few thousand Chinese volunteers symbolically defending the border. MacArthur, convinced it was a sign of weakness, brushed it off and ordered his home by Christmas offensive to proceed as planned. He was poking a sleeping dragon with a stick and had mistaken its warning growl for a yawn. On the night of November 25, 1950, just a day after MacArthur's grand announcement, the dragon woke up. All across the frozen front, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, who were officially designated the People's Volunteer Army, rose up out of the frozen landscape and crashed down on the unsuspecting UN forces. The name itself was a stroke of political genius. By calling them volunteers, Beijing could maintain the thinnest possible veil of plausible deniability, claiming that this wasn't an official act of war by the Chinese state, but rather a spontaneous movement of patriotic citizens helping their Korean brothers. This flimsy excuse helped prevent the conflict from immediately escalating into a nuclear World War III. But to the GIs on the ground, these were no volunteers. This was the entire Chinese army. The initial assault was a terrifying sensory overload. The Chinese attacked at night, often in blizzards. They didn't use radios, which made them impossible to track electronically. Instead, they used a cacophony of eerie whistles, rattling gongs and blaring bugles to signal their movements. For the isolated American soldiers huddled in their frozen foxholes, the first sign of an attack would be these strange, terrifying sounds echoing through the hills, followed by a human wave of padded white camouflaged soldiers materializing out of the darkness and swarming their positions. It was psychological warfare at its most primal and effective. A radio operator at a U.S. Army regimental command post. Radio operator: "Sir, I've got Company B on the line. They say they're surrounded." Colonel: "Surrounded by what? Remnants of the KPA?" Radio operator: "No, sir. They say it's the Chinese. Tens of thousands of them. They came out of the hills. Listen." He turns up the volume. Over the crackle of static and gunfire, a faint, eerie bugle call can be heard. Colonel: "What in God's name is that sound?" Radio operator: "They've been hearing it all night, sir, just before they get hit. Sir, now Company C is reporting the same thing, and the forward artillery battery. They're hitting us everywhere at once." Colonel, staring at his map, a look of horror spreading across his face. "It's not a probe. It's a whole army. Where did they come from?" The home by Christmas offensive lasted one day. By the morning of November 26th, it was clear that the UN forces were not on the verge of a great victory, but were instead caught in the jaws of a catastrophic trap. MacArthur's intelligence had failed. His arrogance had led his men into disaster, and his promise of being home for Christmas was about to become a bitter, ironic joke. The war hadn't ended. A whole new, much more brutal war had just begun. The Chinese surprise attack was not a probe or a skirmish. It was a deluge. The UN front, stretched thin and brittle across the top of North Korea, did not bend. It shattered. In the west, the main Chinese armies slammed into the US 8th Army. The South Korean corps holding the army's right flank completely disintegrated, and the Chinese poured through the gap, threatening to encircle and annihilate the entire force. The triumphant home by Christmas offensive had, in less than 48 hours, turned into a desperate scramble for survival. There was no longer any thought of victory. The only thought was escape. What followed was the longest and one of the most humiliating retreats in American military history. The 8th Army began a full-scale bug-out, a headlong flight south. This was not an orderly withdrawal. It was a chaotic rout, conducted in the face of a relentless enemy and in the jaws of a brutal Korean winter. The temperature plunged to Arctic levels, far below zero. The GIs, equipped with gear that was wholly inadequate for the cold, were fighting two enemies: the swarming Chinese infantry and the crippling, relentless frostbite. It was a nightmare of frozen roads, abandoned equipment, and constant ambushes. If the situation in the west was a disaster, the situation in the east was a frozen hell. There, the U.S. 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the Army's 7th Infantry Division, had pushed deep into the mountains, all the way to a desolate, windswept plateau called the Chosin Reservoir. They were now completely cut off, surrounded by an estimated 10 Chinese divisions. They were outnumbered at least 8-1 and trapped 78 miles from the nearest friendly port. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir became an instant, horrific legend. It was a 17-day running battle that was less a military engagement and more a primal struggle for survival. The cold was a weapon in itself. At night, temperatures dropped to a soul-crushing 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Rifles and machine guns froze solid. Morphine syrettes for the wounded froze in the medics' packs. Sea rations became inedible bricks of ice. A man who sat down to rest for too long would simply freeze to death. Frostbite caused as many casualties as enemy bullets, and the enemy was everywhere. The Chinese held the high ground along the single, narrow, twisting mountain road that was the Marines' only path of escape. They set up roadblocks, launched human wave assaults out of the darkness, and hounded the retreating column every step of the way. It was here that the Marine commander, General Oliver P. Smith, when asked by a reporter if his men were retreating, gave his famous, defiant reply, "Retreat, hell. We're not retreating, we're just attacking in a different direction." It was a masterpiece of grim bravado, and it perfectly encapsulated the spirit of the frozen Chosin. They weren't just escaping, they were fighting their way out, bringing their wounded and most of their equipment with them, inflicting massive casualties on the Chinese in the process. After more than 2 weeks of brutal fighting, the bloodied but unbroken survivors finally reached the port of Hungnam. There, the U.S. Navy performed a miracle of logistics. A Dunkirk in the snow evacuating not only the 105,000 soldiers of the X-Corps, but also 17,500 vehicles, 350,000 tons of supplies, and in an incredible act of humanity, nearly 100,000 North Korean civilian refugees who were desperate to flee the communists. 2 U.S. Marines are huddled behind a frozen boulder at Chosin Reservoir. The sound of bugles echoes in the distance. Marine 1, chattering through frozen teeth. "I never thought I'd miss the Pusan summer. At least then we were just getting shot at. Now we're getting shot at, frozen and starved all at the same time." Marine 2. "Did you hear about the supply drop? Code word for the 60mm mortar rounds is Tootsie Rolls." Marine 1. "Yeah, so?" Marine 2. "So some logistics officer back in Japan didn't read the memo. He thought we were asking for candy. They airdropped us crates and crates of actual frozen Tootsie Rolls." Marine 1 stares in disbelief. "You're kidding me. We're fighting for our lives against 100,000 Chinese soldiers and they sent us candy?" Marine 2. "Yep. I guess the idea is we can try to thaw them out and eat them before a bugle-playing guy in a quilt jacket kills us." By January 1951, the rout was complete. The UN forces had been driven not just out of North Korea, but out of South Korea's capital as well. Seoul fell to the communists for a second time. The UN army that had been at the banks of the Yalu River in November was now fighting desperately to form a new defensive line well south of the 38th parallel. MacArthur's glorious victory had turned to ashes. The strategic advance to the rear was over, and it had been much, much less fun than the strategic advance to the front. The war was back to where it had started, only now it was colder, bloodier, and there was a whole new enemy on the field. The Great Retreat from North Korea wasn't just a military catastrophe, it was a massive public humiliation. The architect of the brilliant Incheon landing, General Douglas MacArthur, was now the commander of the longest retreat in U.S. Army history. For a man with an ego as monumental as his, this was an unbearable stain. But in MacArthur's universe, nothing was ever his fault. The defeat, he reasoned, was not the result of his own hubris or his catastrophic misreading of Chinese intentions. No, the blame lay squarely with the politicians in Washington, D.C. He was being forced to fight a war with an enormous handicap, without precedent in military history. His solution was not to adapt his tactics, but to demand a new war entirely. He was done with this police action nonsense. This was now a holy crusade against Red China, the fountainhead of the evil that had undone his glorious victory. He began to bombard the Joint Chiefs of Staff with a series of increasingly apocalyptic demands. He wanted a full naval blockade of the Chinese coast. He wanted to bomb China's industrial heartland in Manchuria. He wanted to bring in Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese army from Taiwan to open up a whole new front. And then he made his most terrifying request. He wanted the authority to use nuclear weapons. He presented a plan to drop between 30 and 50 atomic bombs on Manchurian cities and troop staging areas, and to create a permanent radioactive dead zone along the Yalu River by seeding it with cobalt. He was, in essence, trying to take the car keys to start World War III. Back in Washington, President Truman was looking at these proposals with abject horror. Truman and his advisors were trying to prevent the exact thing MacArthur was openly campaigning for. Their entire strategy was to limit the war in Korea. The last thing they wanted was a massive land war with China, which would almost certainly drag in the Soviet Union and kick off a global, potentially nuclear conflict. Their main focus was containing the Soviets in Europe, not getting bogged down in an apocalyptic war for Asia. They were trying to invent a new, frustrating, and ugly type of conflict for the nuclear age. A limited war, where the goal wasn't total victory, but the achievement of limited political objectives. MacArthur could not and would not accept this. The very concept was an insult to his entire understanding of warfare. In war, he famously declared, "There is no substitute for victory." He saw the president's caution not as prudence, but as cowardice and appeasement. And so, in an act of breathtaking arrogance, the general decided to go to war with his own commander-in-chief. He began a campaign of open insubordination. He gave unauthorized interviews to the press, publicly airing his disagreements with the administration's policy. He issued a personal ultimatum to the Chinese government, demanding their surrender and threatening them with destruction, completely sabotaging Truman's quiet attempts to negotiate a ceasefire. The final straw came in March 1951. Joseph Martin, the Republican leader in the House of Representatives, sent MacArthur a letter asking for his views on the war. MacArthur wrote back a blistering response, condemning the president's Europe First policy and once again demanding an escalation against China. As he must have known would happen, Martin read the letter aloud in Congress. It was a political bombshell. A five-star general had, for all intents and purposes, openly allied himself with the opposition party to challenge the authority of the President of the United States in the middle of a war. President Dad Truman is on the phone with his wildly popular but reckless son, General MacArthur. Truman: "Doug, what is this I hear? You're telling magazines you want to nuke China? I told you no. The answer is no. We are not starting World War III because you got your nose bloodied." MacArthur: "Mr. President, you are tying my hands. You cannot expect me to win a fight if you won't let me hit the other guy's big brother who keeps handing him rocks." Truman: "Their big brother has friends with nukes too, you idiot. This is not a game. My orders are to stabilize the front and seek a ceasefire. That is the policy of the United States government." MacArthur scoffs: "That is a policy of appeasement. My letter to Congressman Martin has made my position clear. The American people want victory, not a stalemate." Truman goes quiet for a beat, his voice turning to ice. "You're done. It's one thing to want the car keys, Doug. It's another thing entirely to stand on the front lawn and tell the whole neighborhood that your father is a coward for not letting you have them. You are relieved of command. Effective immediately. You're grounded. Permanently." For Truman, this was a fundamental crisis. The principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of American democracy, was at stake. He could not allow a general, no matter how popular or legendary, to make his own foreign policy. On April 11, 1951, Truman did the unthinkable. He fired Douglas MacArthur. The news exploded across America. MacArthur was still a beloved hero, the man who won the Pacific War. He returned home to massive ticker tape parades and gave a legendary farewell address to Congress. Truman's approval ratings plummeted, but the president stood firm. "I fired him," Truman later said, "because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was." It was a brave, politically costly, but ultimately essential decision to reaffirm who was really in charge. With the theatrical demigod MacArthur gone, the Korean War got a new leading man. And he was the complete opposite in every way. Enter General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway was not a sunglasses-wearing, media-courting superstar. He was a tough, quiet, professional paratrooper, famous for wearing a live hand grenade strapped to the shoulder of his harness, as a symbol of his gritty, no-nonsense leadership. He was the janitor who had come to clean up the rock star's trashed hotel room. When Ridgway had first taken command of the 8th Army on the ground in late 1950, just after its previous commander died in a Jeep accident, he had found a force that was utterly broken. It was suffering from bug-out fever, an army that knew only how to retreat. His first and most important job was to turn it back into a fighting force. He toured the entire front talking to his men, relieving incompetent officers and drilling a new sense of purpose and aggression into them. He famously asked his commanders, "What is your objective?" When they would point to a line on the map behind them to retreat to, he would cut them off. "Your objective," he would tell them, pointing at the enemy, "is to kill Chinese soldiers." This was the birth of a new, ugly strategy for a new, ugly phase of the war. The grand, sweeping campaigns were over. The dream of unifying Korea was dead. The new American strategy, implemented by Ridgway, was simple and brutal: attrition. It became known as the meat grinder. The goal was no longer to take territory, but to use the UN's overwhelming superiority and firepower, especially artillery, to systematically kill as many Chinese and North Korean soldiers as possible. The plan was to make the war so costly, so bloody for the enemy, that they would have no choice but to come to the negotiating table, and it worked. Under Ridgway's command, the UN forces finally stopped retreating. In the spring of 1951, they launched a series of powerful, punishing counteroffensives. They clawed their way back north. In March, for the fourth and final time, the city of Seoul changed hands, coming back under UN control. By June of 1951, the front line had pushed back north and stabilized almost exactly where the war had started a year earlier, in the vicinity of the 38th parallel. And there, the war of movement died. Both sides, exhausted and bled white by a year of insane back-and-forth fighting, dug in. They built vast, complex networks of trenches, bunkers, tunnels, and barbed wire that snaked across the entire Korean Peninsula, from one coast to the other. The conflict transformed, almost overnight, into a grim, static war of attrition, eerily reminiscent of the Western Front in World War I. For the next 2 years, the battle lines would barely move more than a few miles in either direction. The war became a stalemate, but a stalemate is not peace. The fighting that followed was some of the most savage and, in many ways, most pointless of the entire conflict. The war was no longer for cities or capitals. It was a war for hills. Tiny, miserable, strategically insignificant pieces of high ground that became invested with immense symbolic importance. Battles would rage for weeks or months over godforsaken piles of rock and mud with names that would be seared into the memories of the men who fought there. Heartbreak Ridge, Pork Chop Hill, the Punch Bowl, Old Baldy. A UN unit would launch a massive assault, taking a hill at the cost of hundreds of lives. They would hold it for a few days, shelled relentlessly, and then the Chinese would launch a massive human wave assault of their own and take it back at the cost of thousands of their own lives. The cycle would just repeat, over and over. 2 American GIs are sharing a can of cold rations in a bunker on Pork Chop Hill. GI 1. You know, for a place called Pork Chop Hill, I ain't seen a single damn pork chop. Just mud, rats, and artillery. GI 2. They call it that, because when you look at it on a map, it's kind of shaped like one. Or maybe it's because it chews you up and spits you out like a piece of gristle. I don't know. GI 1. We took this hill last week, right? Lost half the platoon doing it. Now the lieutenant says the Chinese are massing to take it back tonight. GI 2. Yep. And if they take it, we'll get ordered to take it back tomorrow. It's the stupidest damn dance I've ever been to. The generals want the hill, so we die for the hill. Then their generals want it, so they die for it. The only one who wins is the hill. This was the tragic, forgotten heart of the Korean War. The first year was a cinematic whirlwind of invasion and counter-invasion. The final 2 years were a monotonous, soul-crushing, industrial process of killing. The headlines back home moved on to other things, but on the frozen, blood-soaked ridges of Central Korea, The meat grinder churned on and on and on, devouring men from 24 countries for inches of worthless ground. By the summer of 1951, the Korean War had reached a state of profound, bloody equilibrium. Both sides had shot their bolt. The UN, having abandoned the dream of conquest, had proven it could hold its ground and inflict catastrophic casualties with its superior firepower. The Chinese and North Koreans, having failed in their massive spring offensives, had proven they could absorb those catastrophic casualties and still keep fighting. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition was here. Neither side could win a decisive military victory, but neither side was willing to lose. It was a perfect, horrible deadlock. When you can't win by fighting, you have to try talking. The first public signal that peace might be an option came, ironically, from the war's original sponsor. In June 1951, the Soviet ambassador to the UN gave a radio address in New York, casually mentioning that a ceasefire could probably be negotiated. This was the diplomatic smoke signal everyone had been waiting for. After a flurry of secret messages, the warring parties agreed to meet face-to-face to try and hammer out an armistice. Not a peace treaty. That would be way too ambitious. Just an agreement to stop shooting at each other. The first location chosen for this historic meeting was the ancient Korean capital of Kaesong, a city that sat right in the middle of the front lines, but was currently under communist control. This was a bad sign right from the start. The communist delegation, led by the North Koreans and the Chinese, immediately used the location as a massive propaganda tool. They set up the meeting place to make it look like the UN delegation was a vanquished enemy, coming to them to sue for peace. They flew their flags higher. Their guards were armed to the teeth, while the UN delegation was ordered to come unarmed. It was a masterclass in petty psychological warfare before a single word was even spoken. The talks finally opened in July 1951. And they were, from the very beginning, an absolute circus of mutual hatred and procedural nonsense. The delegates didn't meet to find common ground. They met to score propaganda points and accuse each other of war crimes. It wasn't a negotiation. It was just a continuation of the war by other, more boring means. The very first item on the agenda, where the ceasefire line should be, immediately ground the talks to a halt for months. The UN, led by the Americans, put forward what they saw as a logical, common-sense proposal. Let the line be the current line of military contact. This line snaked across the peninsula, was mostly north of the old 38th parallel, and was based on the most defensible terrain. The communists flatly rejected this. For reasons of pride and propaganda, they insisted that the line had to be the original 38th parallel. To accept the current battle line would be to admit they had failed to conquer South Korea. So they argued, and argued, and argued. And here is the most tragic and insane part of the whole process. While the diplomats in their crisp uniforms were bickering for weeks about which imaginary line to draw on a map, the soldiers in their muddy foxholes just a few miles away were still killing and dying in the meat grinder. In fact, the fighting intensified. Both sides adopted the brutal strategy of talking while fighting. The idea was that a successful attack that captured a strategic hill could strengthen your hand at the negotiating table. This led to some of the most pointless and bloody battles of the entire war, like the fight for Heartbreak Ridge, which raged all through the late summer and fall of 1951. Thousands of men died for tiny pieces of territory that served no purpose other than to be a bargaining chip in a negotiation that was going nowhere. Inside the stuffy negotiating hut at Kaesong, UN negotiator, a stern American admiral. For the 10th time, we reject your proposal to return to the 38th parallel. The current battle line is the only realistic starting point for a ceasefire. Communist negotiator, a smug Chinese general. For the 10th time, we reject your arrogant attempt to profit from your aggression. The 38th parallel is the only line of historical and legal significance. You crossed it. You must return. UN negotiator, this is getting us nowhere. Furthermore, we must protest the fact that your delegation's table is polished with a shinier wax than ours. It is a clear attempt to distract our team with its dazzling gleam. Communist negotiator, we protest the fact that your notebooks appear to be of a higher quality paper than ours. A blatant display of capitalist excess designed to demoralize our scribes. "We will not stand for this paper-based aggression." UN negotiator sighs, rubs his eyes. "We're all going to die here, aren't we?" The Kaesong talks were doomed from the start. They were a festival of bad faith, riddled with accusations, walkouts, and manufactured incidents. The communists accused the UN of trying to bomb the neutral meeting site. The UN accused the communists of using the talks as a shield to build up their forces. Finally, in late August, after a month of fruitless, infuriating bickering, the talks broke down completely. The delegations went home. The hope for a quick end to the war was dead, and on the bloody ridges of Central Korea, the meat grinder just kept on churning. After a 2-month-long sulk, both sides decided that not talking to each other was just as miserable and pointless as talking to each other, so they agreed to give it another shot. In October 1951, the peace talks resumed. This time, however, they moved to a new, truly neutral location, a tiny, desolate village in the middle of no man's land called Panmunjom. It was little more than a collection of tents and huts, but it was a place where neither side could claim a propaganda victory. It was just a miserable patch of dirt where they could get on with the miserable business of ending a war. And for a little while, it actually seemed to work. Away from the political theater of Kaesong, the negotiators made slow, grinding progress. They argued, they postured, but they started ticking items off the agenda. The biggest breakthrough came when they finally agreed on the demarcation line. The communists dropped their demand for the 38th parallel, and the UN won its argument. The ceasefire line would be the current line of military contact. This was a huge step. They hammered out details for a demilitarized zone and a commission to oversee the truce. By early 1952, it felt like the end was genuinely in sight. They had just one final item left on the agenda: the exchange of prisoners of war. This, everyone assumed, would be the easy part. The Geneva Conventions, the international rulebook for war, were pretty clear. At the end of a conflict, all prisoners of war are simply returned to their home countries. It's called all-for-all repatriation. You give us our guys, we give you your guys, everyone goes home. Simple. This should have taken about a week to sort out. Instead, it became the single issue that would derail the peace talks and prolong the war for another year and a half. The problem started when the UN command began screening the prisoners they held in their massive, often violent POW camps on islands like Kojedo. They were holding over 132,000 North Korean and Chinese prisoners. When they started asking a simple question, "Do you want to go home?" they got a shocking answer. Tens of thousands of prisoners said no. Not just no, but hell no. Why? Well, it turned out that many of the so-called Chinese People's Volunteers were actually former nationalist soldiers from Chiang Kai-shek's army. They had been captured by Mao's forces during the Chinese Civil War, and then, as a way to get rid of them, had been volunteered to go fight and die in Korea. They had zero loyalty to the communist regime and wanted to be sent to Taiwan instead. Similarly, a huge number of the North Korean prisoners were actually South Koreans who had been forcibly conscripted into the KPA when it swept south in 1950. They had no desire to live under Kim Il-sung and wanted to stay in the South. This presented the UN, and President Truman in particular, with a massive moral and propaganda dilemma. How could the leaders of the free world possibly force thousands of men at gunpoint to return to communist dictatorships where they would almost certainly be treated as traitors and either executed or sent to a gulag? It flew in the face of every principle they claimed to be fighting for. So the UN negotiators came back to the table at Panmunjom with a new radical proposal: voluntary repatriation. No one would be forced to go home. Every single prisoner would get to choose their own destination. The communist delegation reacted to this proposal as if they'd been slapped in the face. It was a profound public insult. To them, the idea that a soldier of the glorious revolution would choose capitalism over communism was an ideological impossibility. It was a fiction created by American brainwashing and torture. To admit, on the world stage, that tens of thousands of their men didn't want to come home would be a devastating loss of face, a propaganda catastrophe. Their position was absolute and unbending. The Geneva Conventions demanded that all prisoners be returned, every single one, by force if necessary. at the negotiating table in a chilly hut in Panmunjom. UN negotiator, let us be clear. We will not participate in the forced repatriation of men who have explicitly stated they fear for their lives if returned to your custody. It is a fundamental matter of human rights. Communist negotiator, human rights. You speak of human rights while you massacre our men in your barbaric prison camps? This is a transparent political trick. You are trying to steal our soldiers to use them in your future wars. We will not leave a single one of our heroic comrades in your blood-stained hands. UN negotiator, we have a list of 40,000 men who are begging us not to send them back. What do you want us to do? Put them in shackles and throw them across the border? Communist negotiator, how you return them is your affair, but they will be returned. This is our final word. If you refuse, there will be no armistice. The war will continue until you see reason. And on that single intractable issue, the entire peace process collapsed. The talks didn't break down. They just entered a state of suspended animation. The delegates would meet. The communists would demand the return of all their prisoners. The UN would refuse. And then they'd adjourn for the day. For more than a year, this was the only thing they talked about. And all the while, on the hills just a few miles away, the war went on. Men were still dying every single day, not for land, not for politics, but because their leaders in a small hut in Panmunjom were locked in a bitter ideological battle over the fate of men who had already surrendered. It was the tragic absurdity of the Korean War distilled to its purest form. For more than a year, the war and the peace talks existed in a state of suspended bloody animation, both completely hostage to the single intractable issue of the prisoners of war. The fighting on the hills ground on, and the talking in the huts at Panmunjom went nowhere. But as 1952 bled into 1953, there was another major character in this drama who had been relatively quiet, but was now getting ready to make a whole lot of noise. That character was the president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee. From Rhee's perspective, this entire peace process was a complete and utter betrayal. His life's single unifying goal was not just the defense of South Korea, but the unification of the entire Korean Peninsula under his rule. He didn't want an armistice. He didn't want a ceasefire. He wanted total victory. He wanted to march north. A peace deal that would leave Korea divided along the same old line, with the communists still in power in Pyongyang, was his worst nightmare. Furthermore, he was terrified that as soon as the ink was dry on an armistice, the Americans would pack their bags, go home, and leave his country vulnerable to a second invasion. He deeply distrusted the intentions of his powerful ally. So, as the negotiators in Panmunjom began to slowly, painstakingly find potential compromises on the POW issue, Rhee became increasingly desperate to sabotage the whole process. He was the client who had decided he hated the settlement his lawyers were about to agree to, and was now threatening to burn down the entire courthouse. He began by organizing massive, supposedly spontaneous anti-truce demonstrations in Seoul and other cities. He then began to publicly threaten to pull his Republic of Korea army, by now a massive force that made up the bulk of the UN front line, out of the UN command and order it to continue fighting north alone. This was a suicidal, militarily insane threat, but it was politically explosive. The UN was there supposedly to defend South Korea. What would it look like if South Korea itself refused to stop fighting? But his masterstroke of defiance, his ultimate tantrum, came in June of 1953. The negotiators at Panmunjom were closer than ever to a final deal. It seemed the war was, at long last, about to end. And Syngman Rhee decided to throw a grenade into the center of the room. In the dead of night on June 18th, without breathing a word to his American allies, Rhee gave a secret order to his military police. They went to the prisoner of war camps that held the North Korean prisoners who had refused to be repatriated, and they simply opened the gates. Over 27,000 anti-communist North Korean POWs streamed out of the camps and instantly vanished into the South Korean population. It was an act of breathtaking sabotage. The reaction was instantaneous and chaotic. The communist negotiators at Panmunjom were apoplectic with rage. They accused the UN of orchestrating the release as an act of ultimate treachery. The entire delicately constructed deal, which was based on the orderly turnover of these very prisoners, was now a smoking ruin. The talks immediately collapsed. The Americans were just as furious. Rhee had not only sabotaged the peace process, he had publicly humiliated the United States, proving that they couldn't even control their own supposed ally. The UN commander, General Mark Clark, was so angry he seriously contemplated Operation Everready, a pre-existing plan to launch a military coup and overthrow Rhee's government. A blistering phone call between a U.S. general and President Rhee. U.S. General, Mr. President, do you have any idea what you've just done? You've jeopardized everything. We were days away from an armistice. Syngman Rhee, sounding calm and unbothered. General, I have simply liberated my patriotic countrymen who refused to live under the communist yoke. It is you who are about to jeopardize the future of my nation with your treacherous peace deal. U.S. General, treacherous? We have lost over 30,000 men defending your country. Rhee, and I am grateful, but I will not allow their sacrifice to be wasted on a peace that guarantees my country will remain cut in half and vulnerable. You cannot have an armistice without my cooperation, and you will not have my cooperation until you guarantee the future security of the Republic of Korea. U.S. General, is that blackmail, Mr. President? Rhee, it is the reality of our situation, General. Now let us talk about the mutual defense treaty I have been asking for. This was Rhee's insane gamble. By creating chaos and demonstrating that he could not be controlled, he was blackmailing the United States. He was forcing them to choose, either abandon South Korea completely and watch it descend into chaos, making the entire war a pointless waste, or give him what he wanted. And what he wanted were ironclad guarantees. A formal mutual defense treaty that would legally bind the U.S. to defend South Korea, after the war the permanent stationing of U.S. troops on Korean soil, and billions of dollars in long-term economic aid. It was an audacious, infuriating, and ultimately brilliant move by a stubborn old man who was determined to win the peace, even if it meant restarting the war. The war dragged on into 1953, a seemingly endless nightmare of bloody hills and fruitless negotiations. The deadlock at Panmunjom over the prisoner of war issue was absolute. Syngman Rhee was actively trying to sabotage any potential for peace. The soldiers in the trenches were locked in a state of perpetual grinding warfare. It felt like the conflict had achieved a kind of horrible permanence, a forever war that would just chew up lives and treasure until the end of time. It was going to take something massive, something world-shaking, to break the impasse. And then, on March 5, 1953, the world shook. A news bulletin flashed across the wires, a geopolitical earthquake that changed everything in an instant. Joseph Stalin was dead. The Soviet dictator, the man of steel, the supreme puppet master of the communist world, had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died in his dacha outside Moscow. He had been the primary sponsor of the Korean War, the one who had given Kim Il-sung the initial go-ahead, the ultimate backer of the entire enterprise. As long as Stalin was alive, the Chinese and North Koreans were never going to make a major concession without his explicit approval. And Stalin, from his cold, calculating perspective, seemed perfectly happy to let the war grind on indefinitely. It was a fantastic deal for him. It was tying down and bleeding his main rival, the United States, at a relatively low cost to the Soviet Union, which was only on the hook for weapons and supplies, not soldiers. But the moment Stalin died, the entire equation changed. A frantic power struggle immediately began in the Kremlin, from which a collective leadership of men like Georgy Malenkov and Nikita Khrushchev emerged. These were not iron-willed ideologues with grand plans of global conquest. They were pragmatic, brutal bureaucrats who were now in charge of a massive, creaking empire. They had new, urgent priorities: consolidating their own power, dealing with unrest in Eastern Europe, and trying to improve the dismal living standards of the Soviet people. When they looked at the balance sheet, the Korean War was a huge, blinking red liability. It was a dangerous, expensive, and unwinnable mess that they had inherited from the old boss. It offered no clear path to victory and carried the constant, terrifying risk of escalating into a nuclear war with America. They had no personal or political capital invested in it. They wanted out. This change in management had an immediate, profound effect on the war. The new Soviet leaders quickly and quietly, began putting immense pressure on their junior partners in Beijing and Pyongyang. The message from Moscow was clear. This party is over. They strongly advised Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung to find a compromise on the POW issue and sign an armistice. The implicit threat was that the endless flow of Soviet tanks, artillery, and ammunition might not be so endless anymore. It was like the team's terrifying, legendary head coach, who had started this brutal away game and seemed happy to let it go into endless bloody overtime, suddenly had a heart attack on the sidelines. The new interim coaches took one look at the scoreboard, saw the hopeless tie, and realized their main priority was just getting the team back on the bus without any more catastrophic injuries. They started screaming at their players on the field, China and North Korea, to stop arguing with the referees and just end the damn game. A staticky phone line between the new management in Moscow and a weary Mao Zedong in Beijing. Moscow. Comrade Mao, greetings from the new collective leadership. We trust you are well. We are calling about your ongoing project in Korea. Mao, China. It is a noble struggle against the forces of American imperialism. A struggle the great comrade Stalin supported wholeheartedly. Moscow. Yes, about that. Comrade Stalin's priorities were his own. Our priorities involve a new 5-year plan for tractor production. This Korean venture is proving to be a significant drag on our resources. And yours, Mao, China. We cannot simply give in. Our international prestige is on the line. The issue of the prisoners, Moscow. The issue of the prisoners is an obstacle that you will find a way to overcome. We are no longer interested in funding an eternal stalemate. Find a compromise, make a deal. The war needs to end. Is that clear, comrade? A long pause on the line. Mao, China. The message is understood. Suddenly, the immovable boulder at Panmunjom started to shift. The communist negotiators, who had been so rigid and unbending for over a year, suddenly started signaling a new flexibility on the prisoner issue. They were still posturing, still arguing, but for the first time there was a real sense that a deal might be possible. The single most important event that broke the diplomatic deadlock of the Korean War didn't happen on a battlefield or in a negotiating tent. It happened in the bedroom of a dying dictator, half a world away. Stalin's death didn't guarantee peace, but it finally made peace possible. While the Soviet Union was dealing with the death of its supreme leader, the United States was dealing with a political change of its own. The Korean War, with its endless casualties and frustrating stalemate, had become deeply unpopular at home. It was Truman's war, and it was a massive anchor dragging down the Democratic Party. In the presidential election of 1952, the Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower, a beloved 5-star general and the former Supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II, ran on a simple, powerful promise. Frustrated with the endless bickering and bloodshed, he famously declared, "I shall go to Korea." It was a pledge to take personal command of the situation and find a way to end the war. He won in a landslide. When Eisenhower took office in January 1953, he brought a whole new perspective to the White House. He was a career soldier. He understood war in a way Truman, the politician, never could. Never. He had seen the carnage of Demilitarized firsthand, and he was determined to end the fighting in Korea one way or another. He looked at the bloody stalemate and the paralyzed peace talks with a soldier's impatience. It was time to stop messing around. Eisenhower and his equally hard-nosed Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, decided on a new, much tougher strategy to break the deadlock. They believed the communists were just stalling for time and would only respond to overwhelming pressure. Their plan was to convince China that the alternative to signing an armistice was not more of the same trench warfare, but a massively escalated and potentially nuclear war. It was time to stop asking nicely and start making threats. But unlike the bombastic public pronouncements of General MacArthur, Eisenhower's threats were quiet, cold, and delivered with the chilling credibility of a man who had commanded the D-Day invasion. The administration began passing messages to Beijing and Moscow through back channels, primarily via India. The language was carefully coded, but its meaning was unmistakable. The United States, the messages said, felt that if the armistice talks failed, it would no longer feel inhibited by the current geographical limits of the war. Furthermore, the artificial restrictions on the types of weapons that could be used would be lifted. This was diplomatic language for, if you don't sign a deal, we are going to expand the war into China, and we are going to use atomic bombs. To make sure the message was received loud and clear, Eisenhower authorized the transfer of nuclear-capable bombers to American bases in Okinawa, just a short flight from the Chinese mainland. He wasn't screaming and yelling like MacArthur. He was calmly walking into the room and placing a loaded revolver on the negotiating table. He was quietly but very deliberately jingling the nuclear keys. This put the Chinese in an impossible position. They were now being squeezed from two directions. From Moscow, their new, less enthusiastic patrons were telling them to wrap it up and make a deal. From Washington, a popular new president, who also happened to be America's most respected general, was telling them that if they did not make a deal, he was prepared to unleash Armageddon. The old argument that a weak civilian-led America lacked the will to escalate was gone. Eisenhower had the will, the credibility, and the weapons. A quiet back-channel meeting in a neutral embassy. American diplomat. Please inform your friends in Beijing that our new president sends his regards. He is a military man. He does not like stalemates. He believes wars should have endings. Chinese diplomat via an Indian intermediary. We have been at the table for 2 years. It is your side's absurd position on the prisoners that prevents a conclusion. American diplomat. The president has a great deal of patience, but it is not infinite. Please convey to them that if a satisfactory armistice is not signed in a timely manner, my government's patience will run out. And when a soldier's patience runs out, he tends to look for military solutions to diplomatic problems. All options are on the table. Indian intermediary, leaning towards the Chinese diplomat. He means the atom bomb. He is saying they will use the atom bomb on your country. Chinese diplomat goes very still. The message will be delivered. This 1-2 punch of Soviet pressure from behind and the American nuclear threat from the front was the final push that broke the deadlock. The Chinese, pragmatic as ever, looked at their hand. Their main backer was getting nervous, and their opponent was holding what looked like a royal flush and was acting like he was ready to use it. It was time to fold. In the spring of 1953, the communist negotiators at Panmunjom returned to the table and finally, after all the bloodshed and delay, agreed to a compromise on the prisoner of war issue. The door to peace had been opened by the death of a dictator, and it had been kicked wide open by the threat of a nuclear holocaust. The end of the war was, at long last, in sight. With the communists finally pushed to the negotiating table by a combination of Soviet pragmatism and American nuclear threats, the path to an armistice was finally clear. There was just one last, very loud, very angry obstacle in the way: South Korean President Syngman Rhee. Rhee was still in full tantrum mode, furious at the prospect of a deal that would leave his country divided. His unilateral release of the anti-communist prisoners had nearly scuttled the whole process, and he was still threatening to order his army to fight on alone. The United States was now in the absurd position of having to negotiate as hard with its own ally as it was with the enemy. A team of high-level American diplomats flew to Seoul to try and wrangle the furious old man. It was a process that involved a whole lot of pleading, a little bit of threatening, and a great big bribe. The U.S. finally offered Rhee a deal he couldn't refuse. In exchange for him promising to not actively obstruct the armistice, the United States would give him everything he wanted. A formal mutual defense treaty, legally binding America to defend South Korea from future aggression, a permanent presence of U.S. troops on the peninsula, and billions of dollars in long-term economic aid to rebuild his shattered country. Rhee, a shrewd bargainer to the end, reluctantly accepted. He still refused to sign the armistice himself, a final act of protest, but he agreed to let it happen. He had successfully blackmailed a superpower into becoming his permanent bodyguard. With Rhee finally placated, the end was truly near. The Chinese, however, decided they needed to make one final bloody point. They wanted to end the war on a military high note and punish the South Koreans for Rhee's defiance. In the final weeks before the signing, they launched their largest offensive in over a year, slamming into rock-held positions in the center of the front. The fighting was horrific. A last spasm of violence that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides for hills that everyone knew would be part of a demilitarized zone in a matter of days. It was a brutal, pointless punctuation mark on a brutal, pointless war. Finally, the day was set. On July 27, 1953, the delegates gathered at Panmunjom for the signing ceremony. There was no grandeur. There was no celebration. The atmosphere was as cold and hostile as a Siberian winter. The representatives, a U.S. Army lieutenant general representing the UN command, and a North Korean general and a Chinese general representing their side, marched into a specially constructed wooden pavilion. They did not speak. They did not shake hands. They did not acknowledge each other's existence. They sat at separate tables, an ocean of mutual hatred between them, and silently began to sign the 18 official copies of the armistice agreement. The whole joyless ceremony took 12 minutes. Then they stood up, turned their backs on each other, and walked out. And what did they sign? Not a peace treaty. That's the most important thing to understand. An armistice is not peace. It is, in essence, a military document that says, we agree to stop trying to kill each other. It's a ceasefire. It doesn't resolve any of the underlying political issues. It doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the other government. It doesn't formally end the war. It's a glorified, legally binding hall pass that allows both sides to go to their separate corners and stop punching. Technically, the Korean War has never ended. It's just been on a 70-plus-year coffee break. At 10 p.m. that night, all along the 155-mile front, the guns fell silent. After 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days of unimaginable violence that had killed millions of soldiers and civilians and turned the entire Korean Peninsula into a smoldering ruin, there was quiet. For the first time, the soldiers in the trenches could stand up without fear of a sniper's bullet and listen to the strange, unfamiliar sound of nothing. The internal monologues of the American and Chinese generals as they sit at the signing table. U.S. General, thinking, just sign the paper. Don't look at him. Don't give him the satisfaction. 3 years, 36,000 of our boys dead, 1 million of theirs. And for what? We're ending it on the exact same latitude where it started. Just sign the damn paper so we can go home. Chinese general, thinking. Let the American sign first. Let him show his eagerness to end this. We have taught the world's greatest power a lesson. We, the new China, fought them to a standstill. Our nation's pride is restored. But the cost was staggering. Now sign the document with a firm hand. The war is over. The struggle has just begun. The end of the fighting was not a moment of victory for anyone. It was a moment of profound collective exhaustion. It was an end born not of triumph, but of the grim realization that neither side could force its will upon the other. The armistice wasn't a solution. It was a testament to the failure of all parties involved. It was a bitter admission that millions of people had died only to confirm the temporary division that 2 American colonels had sketched on a map 8 years earlier. The fighting was over. The argument was just getting started. The armistice agreement was more than just a promise to stop shooting. It was a blueprint for a new, very strange, and very tense reality. The document's primary purpose was to separate the 2 massive, bloodied, and deeply angry armies to prevent the fighting from accidentally starting up again. To do this, it called for the creation of a buffer zone. Both sides were ordered to pull their forces back 2 kilometers from the final line of contact. This action created a 4-kilometer-wide, 155-mile-long ribbon of no man's land that snaked its way across the entire Korean Peninsula, from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan. It was officially named the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. This is, without a doubt, the most ironically named place on planet Earth, because while the narrow strip of the DMZ itself was mostly emptied of soldiers, the land on either side of it immediately became the most heavily militarized, fortified, and tense border in human history. As soon as the ink on the armistice was dry, North and South Korea began the process of building the world's scariest fence. It was a race to see who could create the most impenetrable fortress. They dug thousands of miles of new trenches and artillery-proof bunkers. They strung up endless fences of barbed and electric wire. They laid millions of landmines, creating some of the deadliest minefields ever known. And just behind this fortified line, they positioned the bulk of their armies. Two massive military machines totaling well over 1 million soldiers with tens of thousands of artillery pieces, rocket launchers, and tanks were now arrayed against each other, destined to stare each other down across a 2.5-mile gap for the rest of eternity. The DMZ wasn't a peacekeeping measure. It was the permanent embodiment of a war that had never ended. In the very center of this sea of hostility, one tiny island of bizarre structured contact remained, the village of Panmunjom, where the truce was signed. It was designated the Joint Security Area, or JSA, the one place where both sides could meet to exchange documents or scream at each other in person. It is one of the most surreal places imaginable. The iconic blue conference huts straddle the military demarcation line, the literal line in the concrete that separates north from south. Inside these huts, you can physically walk from one country to the other. Outside, soldiers from both sides stand in a perpetual, silent face-to-face stare-down, often just feet apart. They are specially chosen for their height and intimidating appearance, and they stand in a modified taekwondo stance, ready for action at any second, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. This tense new border also became the stage for some of the most bizarre and childish rivalries of the Cold War. With shooting no longer an option, the two Koreas engaged in a relentless propaganda war. This passive-aggressive conflict reached its glorious, absurd apex in the 1980s with the Flagpole War. The South Korean government built a massive, 323-foot-tall flagpole in its propaganda village inside the DMZ. Not to be outdone, the North Korean regime immediately responded by constructing an even bigger one in their own propaganda village just across the border. Theirs was 525 feet tall. For a time, it was the tallest flagpole in the world. It was the perfect metaphor for the entire conflict. A pointless, expensive, and deeply childish contest of one-upmanship, built on a foundation of pure, mutual spite. North and South Korea are standing on their respective sides of the newly drawn line. South Korea: okay, we've agreed to stop punching, but I'm watching you. I'm building a wall, and I'm putting landmines everywhere, so don't even think about it. North Korea: you're building a wall, pathetic. My wall will be bigger. My minefields will be minear. I will have 1 million eyes watching you at all times. South Korea: fine. Well, I'm going to put up a really tall flagpole to show my people how free and prosperous we are. Erects a huge flagpole. North Korea: a flagpole? Your puny capitalist flagpole is an insult to the Yuche idea. Behold. A comically larger flagpole magically sprouts from the ground. Ours is taller, a testament to the indomitable spirit of our people under the wise leadership of the great Marshal. South Korea: sighs, flips a switch on a giant bank of speakers. Whatever. Enjoy listening to this pop song about love and friendship for the next 30 years. The DMZ, which was conceived as a temporary buffer to cool things down, instead became the permanent scar of a divided nation. It solidified the temporary line from 1945 into one of the world's most impassable borders. It became a bizarre, accidental nature preserve, a place where rare birds and animals thrived in the absence of humans, completely unaware that they were living in the middle of a tripwire for World War III. It stands today as a perfect monument to the war's outcome, a frozen, bitter, and utterly unresolved conflict. The armistice of 1953 did not bring peace. It brought quiet. And in that quiet, the two Koreas could finally take stock of the absolute devastation that had been wrought upon them. The entire peninsula, north and south, was a smoldering ruin. Nearly every city had been flattened. Its industrial base was obliterated. Millions of civilians were dead. Estimates range from 2 to 3 million. And millions more were homeless, starving, and traumatized refugees in their own land. The war, which had begun with a line drawn on a map, had ended with the country in ashes, with that same line now etched onto the land in concrete, barbed wire, and blood. It had solved absolutely nothing, and had destroyed almost everything. From these shared ruins, the two Koreas embarked on two of the most radically divergent paths in modern history, becoming a real-life political science experiment on the nature of nations. In the south, Syngman Rhee got his wish. backed by the American security guarantee he had blackmailed them into, and flooded with billions of dollars in U.S. aid, South Korea began to rebuild. For decades, it was a deeply authoritarian state, ruled by a series of military-backed strongmen. But underneath the surface of political repression, an economic miracle was taking shape. That aid money, combined with a famously disciplined and educated workforce, built a powerhouse industrial economy centered on giant conglomerates. By the late 1980s, a powerful pro-democracy movement finally toppled the dictatorship, and South Korea emerged as a vibrant, chaotic, and hugely successful democracy. It became a global leader in technology and, improbably, pop culture, a true miracle on the Han River. In the north, Kim Il-sung also used the war's devastation to his advantage. He used the shared trauma and the constant threat of American imperialism to consolidate absolute power, purging all his rivals and creating the world's most totalitarian state and bizarre personality cult. Propped up by aid from the Soviet Union and China, North Korea actually rebuilt faster than the South in the 1950s and 60s, but its rigid state-controlled economy and its fanatical ideology of Jusha, or absolute self-reliance, eventually led to total stagnation and collapse. When the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, the North lost its main benefactor and plunged into a devastating famine. It became the isolated, impoverished, nuclear-armed hermit kingdom we know today, a country stuck in a time warp of its own making. The ceasefire has been anything but. For the past 70 years, the DMZ has been the site of constant low-level conflict. Firefights, infiltration tunnels, commando raids, assassination attempts, the infamous axe murder incident of 1976, and the sinking of South Korean naval vessels. The war never ended. It just went into a long, incredibly tense remission. And so we come back to the fridge. The entire 75-year standoff is the story of two siblings who had a catastrophic fight and divided their shared room with a piece of tape. They have spent the intervening decades living completely separate lives on their respective sides of that line. The South Korean side of the room is a chaotic, high-tech, glittering metropolis. The North Korean side is a Spartan, obsessively orderly shrine to their grandfather. The armistice was simply the moment their parents stepped in and said, "Okay, you will stop throwing furniture at each other. That's the only rule." But the original argument about who started it, whose room this really is, and who is to blame for the whole mess in the first place was never resolved. They are still shouting at each other through the wall, North and South Korea as they are today, yelling at each other over the DMZ. South Korea, broadcasting over its loudspeakers. "Another one of your soldiers defected yesterday. He said he was hungry. Maybe you should spend less money on giant statues and more on food." North Korea, broadcasting back. Lies and propaganda from the American puppets. "Our people are united in socialist bliss under the benevolent care of the respected comrade Kim Jong-un. Your society is a decadent cesspool of inequality and boy bands." South Korea, "At least we have boy bands. You have public executions. And your haircuts are ridiculous." North Korea, "Our haircuts are a symbol of our revolutionary discipline. Unlike your slavish devotion to Western fashion, one day we will liberate you from your capitalist chains." South Korea, Yeah, save it for the next pointless military parade. Just try not to start a nuclear war before lunch, okay? And that's how a temporary administrative line, drawn in 30 minutes by two colonels who just wanted to keep the capital, ended up creating a permanent, gaping wound that has defined the lives of 80 million people. So in the end, Korea wasn't just split in half. It became a tragic, real-life demonstration of what happens when a local family argument gets hijacked by two heavily armed and deeply dysfunctional neighbors who decide to make it all about them. Now, it should be painfully obvious, but please do not cite this podcast in your history thesis. Your professor will cry. But hopefully this was a little more fun than a textbook. If you enjoyed this particular historical train wreck, let us know in the comments what other global messes you'd like us to oversimplify next. We live for the drama. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, because every click helps us afford the therapy needed after reading about events like these. And that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.